Nico found the wedding announcement in a news feed he hadn't been looking at. It was a Tuesday afternoon in October, and he was doing homework at the kitchen table. He had not said anything immediately. He had printed it. He had put it in the drawer by the back door where his mother kept things that required action. And he had waited to see if she would find it. She found it on Thursday. She had stood at the counter for a long time holding the printed page, and neither of them had said anything. And then she had made dinner. Nico Vane was 12 years old, and he had known his father's name for 11 months. He had found it the way he found most things he wasn't supposed to find, by being careful and patient, and by paying attention to things adults assumed he wasn't old enough to care about. His mother kept a lockbox in the closet of her office. Not locked. She had stopped locking it when the boys were around 9. Apparently having decided that whatever was inside was no longer urgent enough to warrant active concealment. The box contained tax documents, the deed to their apartment, his and Seb's birth certificates, and one photograph. The photograph was of Sarah Vane at approximately 22 years old, standing beside a man he had never seen before. They were outside somewhere, a restaurant. Based on the canopy visible at the upper edge of the frame, the man was tall, with dark hair, and the specific kind of easy posture that Nico associated with people who had been comfortable in their own bodies for a long time. His mother was laughing at something. It was the kind of laugh Nico recognized from the evenings when she and her friend Daria drank wine and talked until midnight, open and real. Without the careful modulation she applied to most things, he had looked at the photograph for a long time. He had put it back. He had searched the image with a reverse image search tool a classmate had shown him, the kind used to find original sources for meme images. It took 40 minutes to find a match. The figure appeared in a 3-year-old business publication photograph of a Drexel Holdings event. The man's name was Callum Drexel. After that, knowing where to look, Nico had found everything else in approximately another hour. CEO, billionaire, 38 years old. No public record of marriage or children. He set up a Google alert that Thursday, the same day he found the photograph. The wedding announcement had arrived 11 months later. On a Tuesday in October, he put it in the drawer and waited. That was how Nico handled things. His brother Seb would have told their mother right away. He had the urgent, impatient energy of someone who treated the fastest route between 2 points as the only acceptable one. Nico moved differently. He thought things through, filed them away, and waited for the right moment. His mother called it patience, and his teachers called it self-possession. Nico, with the clear-eyed accuracy he applied to most things, understood that it came from having learned very early to treat information as useful only when it arrived at the right moment. Thursday had been the right moment. Sarah had stood at the counter for 4 minutes. Nico had been watching the clock on the microwave before she set the printed page down and moved to the stove and started pasta water. She had not turned around during the 4 minutes. He watched her shoulders, which did the same precise, very still thing when she was processing something that required full internal attention. It was the stillness of active thought rather than passivity. After dinner, when Seb was in the shower and Nico was finishing homework at the table, she had come and sat across from him. "You found this," she said. "Yes, where I have an alert set up. I've known his name for almost a year." She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the page between them. "How did you find his name photograph?" "In the lockbox." He watched her face make a very small adjustment, not surprise exactly, but the recalibration of someone who had assessed a variable incorrectly. She had thought the box was innocuous enough to leave unlocked, and she had been wrong about that. And she was acknowledging to herself that she had been wrong. He appreciated this about her. She did not perform being unsurprised when she was surprised, but she also did not perform being upset when she was merely recalibrating. "The one from the restaurant," she said. "Yes. I kept it because..." She stopped. She looked at the table. I don't know exactly why I kept it. I think you kept it because he mattered, Nico said, and because some things you keep even when they're complicated. She looked at him. The look had the quality it sometimes had, the quality he knew was her registering that he was 12, and she had not fully accounted for what 12 looked like in him. When are you going to stop being this perceptive? Probably never. I was afraid of that. She picked up the printed page. The wedding is in 6 weeks. I know. Nico. She set it down again. What do you want? He had been thinking about this for 11 months. For the 11 months since he had found the photograph and identified the man in it. For the 11 months during which he had watched his mother not talking about something she was clearly thinking about. During which he had watched Seb growing into the particular restlessness of someone who had questions without answers and was becoming less patient about the absence of the answers. He had thought about it with the thorough, systematic attention he brought to things that mattered, and he had arrived at a specific answer that he had been holding, waiting for the configuration of circumstances that would make it receivable. I want to see him, Nico said. Not to talk to him necessarily. Not to. I don't need anything from him. But I want to see him in person. I want to be in the same room and see what I see. And I think Seb needs that too. Even if he doesn't know how to ask for it. Sierra was quiet for a long time. Outside the kitchen window, the October evening was doing its particular thing, the specific quality of October light that always felt to Nico like something ending gracefully, like the last pages of a book that had been good. He waited. She looked at the announcement. A wedding, she said. It's public. Anyone can attend the ceremony portion. I looked it up. The venue is Cathedral of St. James. They have pews that seat 400. He paused. We could sit quietly. We would sit quietly. We're not going to make a scene. Nico, I know what I'm saying. I know what I'm asking. I know it's a big ask. He looked at his hands on the table. I've been thinking about this for a year. I've thought about all the ways it could go wrong. I still think it's the right thing. She stood. She went to the window and looked at the October evening for a long time. He watched her back the specific geography of his mother's thinking, which he had learned to read from years of being in rooms where she was processing things. The shoulders, the slight tilt of her head, the quality of her stillness. She was not deciding whether he was right. She was deciding whether she was strong enough to allow it. This was the part that mattered, and he knew it. He was not asking her to come with them. He was not asking her to face Callum Drexel. He was asking her to trust that she had raised 2 sons who could walk into a difficult situation without falling apart, and to have enough faith in her own work to let them. You're going to tell Seb tonight, she said, without turning around. If you say yes, and if I say no, then I don't tell him, but I think you're going to say yes. She turned then. She looked at him with the expression that usually preceded her, saying something honest that was also inconvenient. You're going to be a terrible teenager, she said. I'm already 12. You should have seen this coming. Something moved across her face that wasn't exactly a smile, but was close enough to serve the same purpose. She sat back down. She picked up the announcement. She read it again, not the facts. She knew the facts, but something else. Something in the print itself, or in what the print represented, or in whatever 12 years of history she was bringing to the reading of it. He waited. He was very good at waiting. I'll drive you there, she said. I'll wait somewhere close. You have your phones. If anything, if you need me for any reason, we'll call immediately. And you're not going to do anything. We're going to sit in a pew and watch a wedding ceremony. That's all. She looked at him for a moment longer. He held the look. He wasn't performing certainty, he was certain. And that was different. And she could tell because she'd always been able to. Okay, she said. He nodded. He went back to his homework. She sat at the table for another 10 minutes before she got up to check on Seb. Outside, the October evening continued past the window. The announcement sat between them on the table, and Nico did his homework without performing gratitude, because gratitude wasn't what this was. This was a decision that his mother had made because she was strong enough to make it, and performing gratitude would have diminished it. He told Seb after dinner. In their room, with the door closed, Seb was on his bed with the specific sprawl of someone who approached horizontal surfaces as aggressively as he approached everything else. One arm over his eyes in the posture of someone who was nominally resting and was actually thinking hard. Nico sat at his desk. I found something, Nico said. Seb removed the arm from his eyes. He looked at Nico with the particular attention he reserved for things Nico said with that specific quality of weight. What? Our father is getting married. In 6 weeks. Mom said we can go to the ceremony if we want to. Seb sat up. He did it with the full body motion of someone who had been waiting for a version of this sentence for a long time. She said that. How did you? He stopped. The alert. Yes. Seb was quiet for a moment, which was unusual enough that Nico registered it specifically. His brother processed most things in motion, talking, moving, reorganizing the space around him as a way of organizing thought. The stillness meant he was hitting something real. Is she okay? Seb said. She's processing it. She's going to be okay. How do you know? Because she's Mom. Nico looked at the desk surface. She made the decision because we need this. She knows we need it. She's not going to let the fact that it's hard for her get in the way of us having what we need. Seb looked at his hands. They were larger than Nico's. They were both the same height, but Seb's hands were larger. Had always been. In the way that twins were the same and were also completely different from the first moment. What do we want from it? Seb said. What actually? To see him. To be in the same room. To know what we know when we know it in person, instead of through photographs and news articles. And if he sees us, then he sees us. Seb was quiet again. The room around them was the room they had shared their entire lives. The specific disorder of 2 very different people occupying the same space for 12 years. Books on Nico's side, and an organized chaos of sporting equipment on Seb's side. A line of separation that had been established by unspoken mutual agreement around age 7, and that had held. He had been conceived in this city, brought home to a different apartment after the hospital, and moved into this one at 3, when Sarah was finally able to afford the larger space. This was their city. This was their life. The man, who was getting married in 6 weeks, was somewhere in it, and had been somewhere in it for all of their 12 years, and had not known they existed. Do you think he knew, Seb said, about us? Do you think he knew, and just? I don't know, Nico said. I don't know enough to have an opinion about that yet. I need to know. I know you do. That's why we're going. Seb lay back down. He stared at the ceiling. She's really okay with this. She's really okay with this. I don't want to hurt her. Going to his wedding isn't what hurts her, Nico said. Not knowing is what hurts everyone. The not knowing is the thing that's been here the whole time. Seb stared at the ceiling for another moment. Then he said, okay. Just that. Okay. Which from Seb meant more than it would have from most people. Because Seb used very few words for the things he actually meant. Okay, Nico said. They spent the next 6 weeks doing what they always did. School and homework. Sunday dinners with their mother's friend Daria. And weekend trips to the climbing gym they'd been going to since they were 8. The ordinary fabric of their ordinary life. Their mother was, as she had always been, entirely present in the practical dimensions of their daily existence and careful with the emotional ones. She did not bring up the wedding. She did not hover. She did not perform being fine in a way that would have told them she wasn't. She drove them to school and made dinner and asked about their days and helped with the calculus review that Nico had been working through and came to Seb's soccer match on the first Saturday of November and sat in the stands and cheered with appropriate volume and was, as far as Nico could observe, genuinely herself. He watched her carefully during those 6 weeks. The way he watched things he needed to understand. He noticed that she sometimes paused at her desk in the evenings when she thought he wasn't looking, just stopped, in the middle of whatever she was working on, for 10 or 15 seconds, staring at something that wasn't the screen. He noticed that she called Daria more often than usual, though the conversations were brief, and she held them in the kitchen where the natural ambience of the apartment meant he could not hear them without actively trying, which he did not. He noticed that she rearranged the books on the living room shelves one evening, which was a thing she did when she needed to do something with her hands that was also useful. He did not comment on any of these things. She was getting through the 6 weeks and doing it competently on her own. His commenting on it wouldn't have helped. The morning of the wedding, she drove them to the Cathedral of St. James in the good coats she had bought for school concerts and formal occasions, and she pulled up to the curb 2 blocks away, not in front, as they had discussed. Because appearing to drop off 2 boys at the front of a wedding venue would have attracted exactly the kind of attention they weren't seeking. "Text me when you're inside," she said. "We will," Seb said. "Text me when it starts. Text me when it's done. Text me if—" "Mom," Nico said, gently. She stopped. She looked at them both. Her expression was the one she had when she was doing something that cost her something, and she was not going to make it their responsibility to manage the cost. "Be good," she said. "We're always good," Seb said. "You're always good in the ways you define good, which are not always the ways I define good." But she was almost smiling. "We'll call if we need you," Nico said. "We won't need you." She looked at him for a moment. He saw in her face the thing he had seen when she agreed 6 weeks ago. It was the quiet of someone who had decided to trust the work they had done. He nodded at her once. She nodded back. They got out of the car. The Cathedral of St. James was exactly what 6 weeks of research had told them it would be. A large stone building on a corner in the financial district, with wide stone steps, heavy wooden doors, and the kind of scale that made everyone inside feel both small and held. The doors were open and ushers were directing people in. Nico and Seb walked up the steps with the confidence of people who knew where they were going, which was the most effective way to enter any space without being questioned. Inside, the cathedral was already half full. The flowers were white and extravagant, and the pews were deep polished wood, and the light came through the high windows at the winter morning angle. It made everything it touched look as if it belonged to the moment. Nico led them to the front left pew, the one with the best sightline to the head of the aisle, and they sat down. He texted his mother inside. "Front, left pew." He put the phone in his coat pocket. Seb sat beside him and looked straight ahead, with the stillness he only used for things that were important. They waited. The cathedral filled around them. The music began. A string quartet, playing the kind of formal wedding music meant to mark the seriousness of the occasion. The guests settled. Ushers took their places, and a hush moved through the space as the ceremony began. And then the wedding party entered, and at the head of the aisle, moving toward the altar, with the deliberate pace of a man who understood that 150 people were watching him, and who had long since learned to be watched, was Callum Drexel. Nico had seen him in photographs for 11 months. He had read about him and studied his public record, and formed, from that study, an understanding of what kind of person Callum Drexel was. None of that had prepared him for the experience of seeing the man walk into the room. It was the face, familiar from the photograph, but different in motion. In person, it was animated and quietly expressive. someone who kept most of his expressions internal. With the bone structure Nico saw every morning in the mirror, it was not subtle. It was not a resemblance that required interpretation. It was the specific evidence of biology, clear and undeniable, sitting in the bones of his jaw and the set of his eyes. Beside him, he felt Seb go very still. Callum Drexel walked up the aisle. He looked at the guests in the automatic way of someone processing the crowd without specifically focusing on individuals. And then his gaze moved to the front left pew, and it stopped. He stopped looking at the guests and fixed on the front left pew, on the two boys sitting there, for a moment. 3, 4 seconds. Nothing else in the cathedral existed for him. Nico could see it, recognition arriving before understanding. The sharp instant when the visual data reached his brain and registered that something was wrong, not what he expected. Then the next click happened. The understanding folding the wrongness into a single, specific, enormous fact that he could not ignore. Callum Drexel looked at Nico and Seb, and he saw what they were. Nico held the look. He did not look away. He was not challenging or defying. He was simply present, the way he had decided to be present when he put the printed announcement in the drawer 6 weeks ago. He was here, and he was looking, and he was letting himself be looked at. Seb, beside him, held the look too, but differently, with the direct, unflinching quality of someone who had been waiting for this specific moment for longer than he had known he was waiting for it, and who was not going to miss a second of it. Callum Drexel continued walking, because there was nothing else he could do. In a cathedral full of people who had not seen what he had seen and who were waiting for the ceremony to begin, he walked to the altar, and he stood in front of the minister, and he stood there for the entirety of the ceremony that followed. But what Nico saw, what he was watching with the careful attention he brought to things that mattered, was a man who was standing in one place and was somewhere else entirely. Processing, Nico thought. He's doing what I do. He put his hand in his pocket and sent his mother a text. It started. The ceremony lasted 52 minutes. Nico counted without meaning to. He kept time the way he always did. Not obsessively, but as a background feature of how he existed in spaces, always knowing roughly where he was in the available time. 52 minutes of music and vows and the specific formal language of a ceremony that was doing its best to make something permanent out of two people standing in front of a room. He listened to it with a quality of attention that was separate from his main attention, which was on Callum Drexel. Callum Drexel stood at the altar and married Isolde Carmichael. She wore a very good dress and carried herself like someone who had prepared extensively for this moment and was executing that preparation well. She was beautiful in the specific way of people who understood their own presentation, and she seemed genuinely to mean what she said when she said her vows. And Nico had no opinion about her, except that she had arrived at this moment without knowing everything she needed to know to have made an informed decision about it, which was not her fault and was not his problem to solve. During the ceremony, Callum Drexel looked at the front left pew 4 times. Nico counted this too. The first look was in the first 5 minutes, a glance that did not linger. The second and third were during the readings, brief checks that had the quality of someone making sure something they had seen was still there. The fourth was during the exchange of vows, a longer look, and it was during this fourth look that Seb shifted slightly beside Nico, not dramatically, just a small adjustment of his posture, the specific movement of someone who was deciding something. Nico knew Seb's body language the way he knew his own. That small adjustment meant Seb was changing a plan he had arrived with. After the ceremony, the final pronouncement, the walk back down the aisle, the guests rising, Nico and Seb stayed seated, but cleared Vido, following the wedding party's exit, moving toward whatever reception would follow. They stayed seated because they had agreed they would stay seated. because the plan was to leave quietly and report to their mother and let the day close without additional complexity. But Seb was not following the plan. He was sitting in the pew with his hands on his knees, and he was watching the back of the cathedral where the last guests were exiting, and he was doing the thing he did when he had decided something, and was giving himself 30 seconds to reconsider it. Nico knew this look. "Seb," he said quietly. "I know. We agreed. I know what we agreed." Seb turned and looked at him. His face had the specific quality it had when he was about to do something that he had calculated incorrectly, but had decided to do anyway because the incorrect calculation was the one that felt necessary. "I'm not going to say anything wrong. What are you going to say? That we're here? That's all. Just that we're here." Nico looked at his brother for a moment. He thought about it with the speed he used for real-time assessment. That quick. Specific processing worked differently from his deliberate thinking, running on the information he had in the moment rather than on what he'd gathered over weeks. He weighed what saying "times we're here" times would accomplish, what it might risk, and whether the risk was worth it. He thought about his brother's face during the fourth look, the exchange of vows, and about how Seb had looked back at Callum Drexel with the plain expression of someone who needed, above all, not to be invisible. "Don't say anything accusatory," Nico said. "I won't. Don't say anything that sounds like you want something from him." "I know. And don't use Nico." Seb met his eyes. "I know what I'm doing." The minister was still at the front of the cathedral, speaking with two people who appeared to be venue staff. The last guests were almost gone. A few remained, moving slowly toward the exit in the tentative shuffle of people who wanted the night to last a little longer. In another minute, the cathedral would be empty enough that two 12-year-olds in the front pew would stick out to anyone paying attention. "Okay," Nico said, "but I'm right here." "You're always right here," Seb said. He stood up. He stood up in the pew in the nearly empty Cathedral of St. James, and his voice was clear in the acoustic space of the stone building. And he said, "I'm sorry to interrupt. My name is Sebastian Vane, and I wanted you to know that we're here. My brother and I." That was all. 7 additional words beyond the introduction. He sat back down. The silence in the cathedral narrowed into that held, watchful quiet that follows a sentence spoken and somehow leaves the room different. The minister looked up, and at the back of the cathedral, where he had apparently returned for something, a jacket, a forgotten item, something that had brought him back in from the reception line, Callum Drexel stood in the doorway and looked at Sebastian Vane, sitting in the front pew of the Cathedral of St. James. Nico looked back at him. Seb looked back at him. Nobody said anything for a long moment. Then Callum Drexel said, with the specific quality of 2 words that were doing the work of an entire sentence, "Wait, please." He disappeared through the door. They waited. Sarah Vane first met Callum Drexel at a structural engineering conference in Boston in February 12 years and 10 months ago. She'd gone to a panel on adaptive reuse of historic buildings because her firm had just taken on a century-old warehouse conversion, and she was the junior architect in charge of the research. She had not expected the panel to be good. It was very good. The third speaker, a man who spoke with the clean precision of someone who had mapped each sentence beforehand and then chose to say exactly that, was Callum Drexel. And he was presenting on the intersection of structural integrity and commercial viability in heritage preservation. His thinking laid out so that one point supported the next, and the whole argument read like a load-bearing structure. The clarity of it feeling almost architectural. She had written down 14 things in her notebook. She had sat next to him at the conference dinner that evening because the seating was alphabetical by registration, and V fell near D in the particular configuration of the table arrangement. And she had thought he would be the kind of person who was different off-panel, who performed on stage and managed through dinner, and was smaller in ordinary conversation than in the formal space. He was not. He was. In fact, more interesting in ordinary conversation, in the specific way of people whose thinking ran faster than their presentations and who used informal settings to go to the places the presentation didn't have time for. They had talked for 3 hours. She had not noticed the dinner ending. They had talked past the clearing of the dessert plates, past the departure of most other attendees, past the moment when the wait staff began to hover, with the specific hovering of people who needed the table and were too professional to say so directly. They had talked about buildings, about what buildings were for, about the difference between a building that worked and a building that was good, about whether goodness in architecture was a function of the building or of the people inside it. She had opinions about this that she had never fully articulated before, because the people she worked with were competent and focused, and they talked about what worked, not about what it meant that it worked. Callum Drexel asked her what she thought it meant. She told him. He listened in the kind of way that wasn't waiting for its turn, but was actually taking in what she said. Then he said something that reshaped what she thought she'd meant. Not correcting, but refining it. And she thought, oh, this is a person I can talk to. They had exchanged numbers in the lobby, and she had not expected him to call. He called the next morning, while she was still in the hotel, to ask if she wanted to see a restoration project he was consulting on in Cambridge before she flew home. She went. The project was a 19th century mill building, and it was extraordinary the way they had preserved the timber framing while meeting modern load requirements. The specific decisions about what to show and what to conceal. She and Callum had walked through it for 2 hours, and she had asked questions and he had asked questions, and by the time they were back in the taxi to the airport, she had understood something about the potential of buildings that she had not understood when she arrived in Boston 2 days earlier. He had called again 3 days later. She had called him the day after that. The conversations were long and ranged over things that were only partially about architecture, about cities, about the way people organized themselves into spaces, about what she wanted her practice to become, about what he was trying to do with Drexel Holdings that was different from what his grandfather had done, and why the difference mattered to him. He asked questions, and he meant them, and he listened to the answers, and he came back to them later in the conversation, which was the specific sign of someone who had heard what you said rather than what they had expected you to say. They met in person again 3 weeks after Boston, when he was in New York for a board meeting and she was working late at the office, and he texted at 7:30 asking if she had eaten yet. She had not. They had dinner at a place on Lexington that was good and not expensive, which she had noted as a choice. He could have gone anywhere, and the choice said something. They talked for 4 hours and walked back to her block in the November cold and stood on the corner, and the conversation kept going. And when she finally said she needed to sleep, he had looked at her with a directness that was not aggressive but was very clear and said he was going to be in New York the following week for 2 days, and he would like to see her again. She had said yes. The following 6 months were the 6 months she had not fully let herself think about in 12 years. They returned only in that specific, involuntary way. Thoughts that came against your will in the 3 a.m. moments, on long train rides, or in the particular silence of Sunday mornings. She had not let herself think about them because she had decided, at some point in the first year of the boys' lives, that thinking about them was not useful. It had happened, and it had ended. The ending was what she had to live with, and living with that ending required not rehearsing the beginning. But the beginning had been 6 months in which she had been more completely herself than at any other point in her adult life. He had that quality, the quality of someone who paid attention, who asked real questions and heard real answers, who made space for the actual person rather than the edited version. She had given him the actual version. She had talked about her father, the specific shape of her complicated feelings, a man who had not been reliably present and who had made it a practice of presenting his failures as other people's unreasonable expectations. She had talked about her work and what she wanted it to become, and why she was afraid of some of those desires. She had told him why that fear was probably going to be useful. She had talked about the specific loneliness of being one of 3 women in a firm of 22 people, and finding that the loneliness was not about the numbers, but about the way the space was organized. He had listened to all of it. He had asked questions. He had told her things in return about the specific difficulty of being the person designated to continue a thing rather than to create it. He spoke about what his grandfather had built correctly and what had been built wrong, and about the particular weight of a name that arrived with expectations he had not chosen. She had heard it. They had been, for 6 months. The specific version of 2 people that only became possible when both people were paying attention. And then, in September, 3 weeks after she had found out she was pregnant, and 1 week after she had decided how she was going to tell him, he had stopped returning her calls. Not gradually, not with the slow trailing off of someone who was putting distance in place. Suddenly, in the way of a door closing, 2 messages unanswered. Then 3. Then a week of silence. Then the phone rang, and rang without going to voicemail, which meant her number had been blocked. She had stood in her kitchen in September looking at her phone, and she had thought, something has happened. Not he. Decided he doesn't want this. Something has happened. Something I don't have information about. Something has changed in a way I can't see from here. She had gone to her father. This was, in retrospect, the decision she had made that she most wished she could revisit, not for her sake, but because going to her father had put her inside a frame he controlled, and the frame he controlled was not one that served her. He had listened to her. He was a man who was good at listening, who gave the impression of engagement while managing the situation in his own interests, and he had said he would make some calls and see if there was something he could find out. She had not asked him to do that. She had wanted to talk to someone, not to have someone act on the conversation. 3 days later, he had arrived at her apartment with an envelope. The envelope contained a check for $45,000. The check was drawn on an account she didn't recognize. Her father had explained, in the specific, gentle way he had for delivering information that was supposed to be received as care. The Drexel family had apparently been made aware that Callum had been seeing someone and had concerns about the situation. The family had reached out through channels. He was vague about the channels and had wanted to ensure that things were handled with appropriate discretion. The money was to make sure she was comfortable, to make sure there wasn't he had used the word times complication. She had looked at him. She had looked at the check. She had understood, with the very fast processing that arrived in moments of genuine shock. Several things simultaneously. Someone in the Drexel organization had arranged the payment. Her father had been the conduit. Complication was a reference to the pregnancy she had not yet told him about. And someone had told the Drexel organization about the pregnancy before she had been able to tell Callum herself. She had taken the check out of the envelope. She had torn it in half. She had given the halves back to her father, and she had told him to leave. He had left. He had not argued, which was itself informative. The absence of argument from a man who argued habitually was the specific silence of someone who had already received something from the arrangement and did not need to negotiate further. She had spent the night in her kitchen thinking. She had been 22 years old and 3 months pregnant. She had just been given $45,000, had torn it in half, and her phone was still blocked. She had thought about calling the Drexel Holdings main line, about finding another way to reach Callum directly, about insisting on the conversation she was owed. She had spent the night thinking about this, and in the morning she had looked at what she had, and she had decided what she had herself. The baby. The job she was good at and was going to be better at. a sister city of people who had not yet become her people, but who would, because she was the kind of person who built things that lasted. What she did not have Callum Drexel, who had not answered his phone or returned her messages, and whose family had paid or tried to pay her to remain absent. She did not know why he had stopped answering. She had 3 possible explanations, and none of them led anywhere she could act on. She could not demand a conversation from someone who had blocked her number. She could not unmake what had been made. She could not go backward. She could only go forward. She went forward. She did not tell her sons, until they were 11 years old. More than this, that their father was a man she had known and cared for. That things had ended in a way she had not chosen. That she would tell them more when they were old enough for the full complexity. She had been waiting for old enough for 12 years. She had found that old enough was not a specific age, but a specific readiness. And she had seen that readiness arrive in Nico when he put the announcement in the drawer and waited 3 days for her to find it. 3 years ago, when the boys were 9, something had changed in what she allowed herself to know about the situation. She had been going through old documents, the usual occasion of annual tax preparation, the unsexy business of paper, and she had found, in a box she had not opened in years, a copy of a bank statement from the month the money was offered. Her father, as executor of her financial life at the time, had been co-signatory on one of her accounts. The statement showed a deposit not to her account, but to a second account she had not known existed, which bore her father's name but had a routing code she did not recognize. $45,000. September of the year. The boys were born. Her father had taken the money. He had told her the check had been given back. He had kept the money, and he had kept the knowledge of it, and he had died 4 years ago a heart attack in his own kitchen. Clean and quick, without having told her anything. She had sat with this information for 3 years. She had not known what to do with it, because the person she needed to confront with it was dead. The person she might have confronted indirectly, Callum Drexel, was someone she had not allowed herself to think about in the deliberate way that would have led to action. She had filed it. She had put it in the category of things that were true and that she didn't know what to do with yet. And then Nico had put the announcement in the drawer. Callum Drexel was getting married. He was getting married. That meant the 6 months, 12 years ago had resolved into a life that did not include her or the boys. And it was the ending she had always known, but had never wanted to look at directly. She looked at it now. She looked at it and thought about the bank statement. Her father, Callum's face in the lockbox photograph, and the 2 12-year-old boys who deserved to know where they came from. She had sat in the car outside the cathedral this morning with her coffee going cold. She had thought about all of it. She had watched Nico and Seb walk up the stone steps in their good coats, with the specific self-possession of boys who had been raised by someone who believed that the world was a place you were entitled to occupy confidently. She had watched them go through the heavy wooden doors, and she had thought, I don't know what Callum knew. I don't know what happened on his side of this. I spent 12 years being certain I knew, and I am not certain anymore. She was sitting 2 blocks away in a coffee shop with a laptop she was not using when Nico's text arrived. It started. She put her phone down. She picked up the coffee. She looked out the window at the November street, which was doing what November streets did, people moving with purpose, heads slightly down against the cold. The specific, ordinary business of a city on a Saturday morning. Somewhere, 2 blocks from here, her sons were sitting in the front pew of a cathedral, watching their father get married. She thought about this with the full attention she usually reserved for architectural problems, the specific quality of engagement that was not emotional, but was also not detached, that was genuinely present with the shape of the thing. She thought, I don't know what he knew. And she thought, I think I need to find out. Not for the boys, they could find out their own things in their own time. For herself. Because she had been living inside a story for 12 years that had been told to her by someone who had taken $45,000 to tell it. And she was not sure, anymore, that she knew what the actual story was. She looked at the window. The November morning continued. She waited. The second text from Nico arrived 37 minutes after the first. It was not the message she had expected. It was, "Something happened. Still okay." Seb spoke. Callum Drexel said, "Please wait. We're waiting." She read the text 3 times. She set the phone down. She picked it up again. She stared at the phrase Callum Drexel said, "Please wait," and thought about what that meant coming from a man who could have done nothing. He could have let them sit in the empty cathedral until they left on their own. He had every reason and every social justification to walk away from 2 unknown boys in a pew on his wedding day. She thought about the specific 2 words, not "times go away," not "times someone deal with this," but "times please wait." She thought he doesn't know. It arrived with the specific quality of things that were true and that reorganized everything around them. He doesn't know. He doesn't know about the boys. He blocked her number because someone told him to, or gave him a reason to. And whatever reason he had been given was the same lie she had been given, just from the other side. Her coffee was cold. She ordered another one. She sat with the new coffee, and the new understanding, and the November street outside, and she thought about 12 years, and about what a person did with the understanding that the story they had been living inside was not the actual story. She thought about Callum Drexel saying, "Please wait," to 2 boys he had never seen before who had his face. She thought about what that meant, about who he was, at least in this moment, at least in this specific choice. She was still sitting with this when the 3rd text arrived. 17 minutes after the 2nd. It was from Seb, which was unusual. Seb rarely texted when something was happening, preferring to call. "The text," said Mom. "He came back. He's talking to Isolde. I think the wedding might be over. We're still in the pew. Coming to find you." She stood up. She left money on the table. She walked out of the coffee shop into the November cold, and she stood on the sidewalk, and she thought about where to be when her sons came out of that cathedral. She thought about whether she was ready for whatever came next. She thought about 12 years and about the bank statement and about her father and about Callum Drexel's voice saying, "Please, wait," in an empty cathedral to 2 12-year-old boys who had come to look at him. She walked toward the cathedral. Not all the way. She stopped at the corner, half a block away, where she could see the stone steps and the heavy wooden doors and the November sky above the building. She stood there and she waited. 2 blocks north, Daria was in her apartment with her phone on, and her day cleared, having been told last week that this Saturday might require short notice company. 1 block east, a coffee shop that made decent tea was open until 3. She was not going to need Daria, or the tea, for at least another hour. She stood at the corner and she looked at the cathedral and she waited for the doors to open. They opened. What Callum Drexel had been doing in the 7 days before his wedding, the 7 days during which everything he believed about a specific period of his life was being revised, was the particular work of a man who understood that there was no good time for this kind of revision. He also understood that the timing was not something he was going to be able to control. He had found the documents on a Monday. His legal team was going through the final stages of the estate settlement for his grandfather, Leonard Drexel, who had died 3 years ago, and whose estate was still complex enough that the process was not entirely complete. They had flagged a payment that did not correspond to any business record they could identify. $45,000. September of the year. That was 12 years ago. The payee name was Graham Vane. There was a note in the file, in Leonard Drexel's handwriting, the precise hand of someone who had spent a lifetime writing things down so he would not be mistaken, that said, "Settlement Callum Vane situation. Clean." And a second note, clipped to the first times, No continuation. Confirmed per GV. He had looked at these two notes for a long time. He had been in the conference room of his attorney's office, going through documents that mostly required a signature and a quick review. And he had stopped at the file with the payment record and the two notes, and he had not moved for approximately 4 minutes. Then he had asked his attorney to give him the room. His attorney, who had been with Drexel Holdings for 8 years, and who understood when a request was the kind that should be complied with immediately, had left. He had sat alone in the conference room, and he had thought about Sarah Vane. He had not thought about Sarah Vane in several years, not specifically or deliberately, and not with the full attention his thoughts were capable of. He had thought about her in the first year after September, the way he had thought about everything from that time, with the specific pain of something he had trusted and been wrong about, with the kind of betrayal that went directly to the ability to trust rather than sitting more gently on the surface. He had received the information she had taken money from his family. She had agreed to disappear, and he had believed it because the information came with documentation and because his grandfather was the most reliable source in his life, and because the alternative, which was that someone he had genuinely trusted, had been deliberately driven away from him. It was not something he had been able to hold at 26 without restructuring everything he understood about the people around him. He had not investigated. This was the thing he would carry later. The fact that cost him the most to admit he had not investigated. He had a document, his grandfather's word, and a phone that was suddenly not returning his calls. He had built a case from those 3 things that was internally consistent and did not question it, because questioning would have required him to look at his grandfather and ask, "Times did you do this?" And the answer to that question would have arrived too late in his development to sit easily with everything else that was already built. He had not asked. He had gone forward. He had been 26 years old. His first experience of letting someone fully past the specific defenses he had built around himself, the ordinary kind people put up when they were very young and needed them, had apparently ended with that person taking money to disappear. He had incorporated this as information and moved forward. The alternative, collapsing inward, was not available to him. And now he was in a conference room on a Monday, looking at a payment record that showed $45,000 going to a man named Graham Vane, not to Sarah Vane. 2 notes in his grandfather's handwriting said times, settlement times, and times confirmed per GV, which read to him as confirmation by Graham Vane that whatever his grandfather needed, confirmed, had been confirmed, and that the money had likely been taken in exchange. She had not taken the money. The money had gone to her father. He had sat in the conference room and thought about it with the clear-eyed attention of someone who did not let himself show emotion until he understood what he was feeling. He felt the particular cold clarity of understanding something you should have understood much earlier. He felt the specific grief of a loss that turned out to have been not what it appeared to be, which was not a return of the thing lost, but a revision of what the loss had been. He felt the thing that was not quite anger, not the hot anger of betrayal, but the colder recognition of having been managed, of having been a piece in someone else's arrangement, without knowing it. He had thought about Sarah Vane. He had thought about the 6 months before September, and about the specific quality of her, the way she engaged with things, the directness of her thinking, the fact that she had been present in conversation in the way that very few people were present, genuinely there and genuinely available. He had thought about what it would mean if the ending had not been what he'd been told it was. He had thought about where she was now and what 12 years had looked like from her side. He had not been able to call her. He had found, in the conference room with the documents in front of him, that he did not know what she would want from him. If anything, if she had spent 12 years with the version of events she would have been left with, that version would be that he had disappeared. His family had arranged a payment to make the situation go away, and she had been treated as a complication. He did not know if the right thing to do was to reach out or to stay away. He did not know if there were consequences he was not aware of, if there was someone else. If 12 years had built themselves into a life that a phone call from him would disrupt rather than help. He was getting married in 7 days. He had known Isolde for 3 years and had built with her the kind of relationship that was possible between two people who respected each other and had compatible goals and were not naive about the terms they were operating under. It was not what he had had with Sarah. Nothing before or since had been what he had had with Sarah, but it was real in its own right. She did not deserve to have the 7 days before her wedding reorganized by information her groom had uncovered in a conference room on a Monday. He had thought about how to have that conversation. He had not had it yet. He had had the week. He had moved through the week with the specific machinery of someone who had a great deal to manage and was managing it in layers. The surface layer was the wedding preparation, the professional obligations, and the ordinary things. The interior layer was the ongoing process of integrating information that arrived too late and had to be arranged around everything else. He had thought about Sarah Vane on the train to work, and at the desk between meetings, and at 3 in the morning when he had stopped being able to sleep. He had thought about what the right thing to do was, and arrived. Repeatedly. At, I don't know. Not yet. Not with enough information. And then he had walked into the Cathedral of St. James on a Saturday morning and looked down at the front left pew. And the question of what to do with the information had become irrelevant. Because the information had 2 faces and 2 sets of eyes, and they were looking at him. He had walked to the altar. He had done this because there was nothing else to do. Because 150 people were in the cathedral expecting a ceremony, and the ceremony was not his to cancel on behalf of whatever was happening in his chest. He had stood at the altar, and he had said his vows, and he had heard Isolde say hers, and he had been, for the entirety of the ceremony, somewhere else. He had been in September, 12 years ago, in a kitchen in Manhattan where Sarah had cooked dinner, and they had argued pleasantly about whether the Seagram building or the Lever House better represented the ambitions of mid-century corporate architecture, and she had been right, and he had admitted she was right, and she had looked at him with the specific expression of someone who was both pleased about being right and also genuinely interested in why she was right. He had been in November, at a corner on a cold evening that kept going when it should have ended. He had been in the conference room with the documents, and in the week after, and in the specific geometry of a situation that had been wrong for 12 years and was being made right in the only way it could be made right, which was by being seen. After the ceremony, when guests began to file out, and he went with the procession into the November morning for photographs and congratulations, he slipped back inside. He told Isolde he needed 2 minutes. It wasn't the explanation she deserved, but it was the one that would hold long enough. He had gone back inside, and he had found them still in the pew, which was what he had hoped for when he said, "Please wait." And Sebastian Vane, the one on the left, the one who had spoken, the one with his mother's directness in the set of his mouth and his own jawline in the bone beneath it, had stood and said, "I'm sorry to interrupt. My name is Sebastian Vane, and I wanted you to know that we're here." He had looked at them. He had said, "Wait." He had meant, "Don't go anywhere." He had meant, "I need to do one more thing and then I'm coming back to this." The one more thing was Isolde. She was outside in the November morning with the other members of the wedding party and the first wave of guests. She was doing what she did best, being gracious and present and handling the social machinery of an occasion with the steady competence he had always respected. She looked at him when he came out and read his face, which she was very good at reading. Then she stepped away from the group without being asked. In 4 sentences he told her what he'd found on Monday and what he'd seen in the pew. He had not softened it. She had listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and he watched her do what she always did, quickly sorting the facts in private. the fast work of someone very intelligent faced with hard news. "Your sons," she said. "Yes. You didn't know." "No." She looked at the cathedral doors. Her expression wasn't what he had expected. Not devastated, not betrayed, but something more complex and more honest. The look of someone fitting a new piece into a picture that, once the piece was there, had always been missing something. "Go back in," she said. "Isolde, go back in. Callum, we'll talk later. We have things to talk about." She looked at him with the specific quality of someone who was being very clear. "But those boys are in there, and they came here for a reason, and you know what that reason is. And whatever we need to sort out. It's not more important than what's in that pew right now." He looked at her and thought about what he'd built with her, what was real in it, and what it deserved, and about the difficult, honest conversations they would have to have, and how they would take time. He had thought about all of this in approximately 3 seconds, because that was what the moment allowed. "Thank you," he said. "Go," she said. He went. He came back into the cathedral through a side door, walked up the aisle, stood before the front left pew, and looked at his sons. Nico had his mother's face, the quality of her thinking visible in his, the specific watchfulness that was not suspicion, but assessment. The kind of looking that took in more than it appeared to. Seb had his jaw and his color, and something in the set of his shoulders that he recognized as himself at 12. The specific posture of someone who was ready for whatever came next and was comfortable with that readiness. He stood in front of them, and he did not know how to begin. He had given speeches in front of rooms of 200 people. He had negotiated deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He had managed the specific difficulty of high-stakes conversations for his entire professional life. And he was standing in an empty cathedral in front of 2 12-year-old boys, and he had no idea how to begin. "I didn't know," he said, which was not the beginning he would have chosen, but was the truest thing he had. Nico looked at him. "Didn't know what?" "Specifically, that you existed," Callum said. "Either of you." The silence in the cathedral held the words for a moment. He watched Nico's face process this, not visibly. It was a very controlled face, but he could see it happening in the slight adjustment around his eyes. The specific recalibration. Seb was watching him with less control. His face was doing more. The expression moving through several things before settling into something that was not quite certainty but was close. "We need to find our mother," Nico said. "She's 2 blocks away." "Yes," Callum said. "I know. I'd like to come with you, if that's all right." Nico looked at Seb. Seb looked at Nico. Something passed between them that was the specific communication of people who had been doing it their entire lives and who no longer needed language for the basic agreements. "Okay," Nico said. They walked out of the cathedral into the November morning. The 2 boys and the man who was their father, and somewhere 2 blocks north. Sarah Vane was standing at a corner watching the stone steps. She saw them when the cathedral doors opened. She saw Nico first. He came through the heavy wooden doors with the specific quality of someone who knew exactly where he was going and was moving there directly. Then Seb, a half step behind, in the way he had always been, a half step behind Nico in public spaces, not because he was slower, but because he was giving himself the reading time. The 3-second assessment before he arrived. And then, behind them, a man she had not seen in 12 years and 9 months and 8 days, who had the same face her sons had when they were doing something that cost them something. She thought she was ready. And she'd been standing at the corner for 11 minutes, thinking through how she would handle the moment, how she'd keep her face steady, reminding herself that 12 years of practice had taught her not to let hard things show. She had done the mental preparation that was available, the specific self-organization she had learned in the years of doing difficult things alone. She was not ready. There was no ready for this. She watched Callum Drexel walk down the stone steps of the Cathedral of St. James with her sons on either side of him, and she thought about October 12 years ago, and about the check her father had deposited, and about the word time's complication, and about how she had stood in her kitchen and decided to go forward, and she felt, briefly and completely, the weight of 12 years of going forward. Then it passed. She was a person who knew what grief felt like, the specific quality of it, the way it arrived, and how long it stayed, and what you did while it was there. She let it arrive. She let it pass. She was still standing at the corner when Nico saw her. He lifted his hand, not a wave, a specific gesture. The two-finger raise, that was his version of, "I see you. I know where you are. Come toward us or stay. Your choice." She had given him that gesture when they were small, and she had been across a playground watching, and he had looked over to locate her. He had made it his own. She loved him so completely for it that it was almost not bearable. She walked toward them. The distance was half a block, which was enough distance to see the configuration of the approach. Nico moving to her left side. Seb dropping back to let the geometry organize itself. Callum stopping approximately 10 feet away when it became clear she was going to be able to close the distance without his help. He stopped, and he let her cover the last 10 feet, which was the right decision. And she thought it as the right decision, and felt something shift very slightly in her assessment of the situation. She stopped 4 feet in front of him. She looked at him. He looked at her. He looked like someone who'd been rehearsing this meeting for a long time and running through responses in his head. Now that it was happening, he was scrambling to revise everything he'd planned. He was different from 12 years ago, older in ways you could see. The particular gap between 26 and 38. The sort of time that had been used heavily and had left its marks on his face without making him less. He looked tired, which made sense. He had been carrying something heavy this week, and today, every part of that burden had finally become visible to everyone. "Sarah," he said. One word. Her name. He said it as if the name carried a particular heavy weight for him that landed in his voice. "Callum," she said. The November street continued around them, people passing. A taxi going by. The city going on, and not pausing for the small, intense thing happening in front of the cathedral. Nico was to her left. Seb was behind Callum, and slightly to the right. The configuration had a specific geometry, she registered. Her sons had placed themselves where they could take in what was happening and be ready. They were present without standing in the middle of it. "I didn't know," Callum said. He looked at Nico, and then at Seb, and then back at her. "I need you to know that. I didn't know about them." "I know," she said. He looked at her. Something in the certainty of her response surprised him. He had expected more resistance, the friction of someone who'd spent 12 years believing one thing being asked to change. He had not expected her to already know. "My father took the money," she said. "I found out 3 years ago. I didn't know before that." He was quiet for a moment. The processing was visible. She could see him fitting the new fact alongside whatever else had brought him to this morning and shaping it into a larger understanding. "The payment went to your father," he said. "Graham Vane." "Yes. We found it in the estate settlement." He looked at the ground for a moment, then back at her. "My grandfather arranged it. I didn't know. I didn't ask the right questions at 26, and I should have, and I didn't. I didn't ask them either," she said. "I thought you knew. I thought." She stopped. She looked at her sons for a moment. Nico was watching with the particular attention of someone who was filing everything. Seb was watching with the particular attention of someone who was feeling everything. She looked back at Callum. "I thought you knew and had chosen not to. I thought you had taken the money and chosen to go." They stood on the November street with 12 years of wrong information between them. It was not comfortable, but it was honest. and she had always chosen honesty over comfort whenever she could. "What did he say to you?" she asked. "Your grandfather. He showed me a document. Said you had been given a settlement and had agreed to no further contact. Said you had taken it." He looked at her steadily. "I was 26, and I trusted him. I should have called you directly. I should have. It was blocked," she said. "My number. After the settlement was offered, your number went dark, and mine got blocked." He was quiet. He looked, briefly, like someone absorbing a specific blow, not the generalized pain of the situation, but one particular detail that had not yet settled into place. "I didn't do that," he said. "I wouldn't have done that." "I know," she said, and she did know, with the clarity of someone who had carried a wrong assumption for 12 years and had only recently seen it clearly. "I know that now." Beside her, Nico cleared his throat very quietly. She looked at him. He looked at Callum and then at her with an expression that said there are other things happening here too, and some of them involve us specifically. She looked back at Callum. She said, "They found you themselves. I want you to know that I didn't. This wasn't something I arranged or directed. Nico found your name on his own. A year ago. He told me about the wedding 6 weeks ago and asked if they could come. I said yes because..." She stopped. "Because they needed to. Because I raised them to know what they needed, and to say so, and to trust that the world would accommodate the asking even when it didn't know how yet. Because they were right to want it." Callum looked at Nico. "You found me on your own. Reverse image search," Nico said, "from a photograph. In my mother's lockbox. The one from the restaurant." Something crossed Nico's face, surprise. Quickly controlled. The specific adjustment of someone who has discovered that the other person has more context than expected. "You remember that?" "I remember everything from that period," Callum said. "And then, with a specificity that Sarah felt in the way you felt things that were true and important, I kept a photograph from it too." The November morning held this for a moment. The four of them stood on the sidewalk in front of the Cathedral of St. James, not the most private spot, not the most comfortable configuration, and carried the weight of what had been said, what remained to be said, and what couldn't be said in 5 minutes on a sidewalk. "Is there somewhere we can go?" Callum said. Not he gestured. Slightly. At the cathedral behind him. "Not here. Somewhere we can sit down." She looked at her sons. Seb looked back at her with an expression that was the expression he used when he was leaving a decision entirely. To her, not because he didn't have an opinion, but because he understood this was her decision and was choosing to defer completely. Nico's expression was slightly different. He was neither pushing nor deferring. He was simply available for whatever she decided, which was the most complete trust he could have offered, and which she felt as specifically as if he had said it. She looked at Callum. She thought about the coffee shop 2 blocks away that made decent tea and was open until 3. She thought about what a conversation in a coffee shop looked like versus what it needed to be. And she thought about whether she was ready to begin whatever this was going to be in a coffee shop on a Saturday morning, 2 blocks from the cathedral where he had been getting married an hour ago. She thought, "I have been not ready for things before, and I have done them anyway, and they have generally been right." She thought, "The readiness comes after, not before." She thought, "My sons are standing beside me, and whatever they need from the next hour, they are going to get it, because that is what I do." "There's a coffee shop," she said, 2 blocks east. They walked. The walk was silent in the way that silences could be full rather than empty. 4 people moving through a November morning carrying information that needed more space than a sidewalk to be properly organized. She walked on Nico's left. Seb was on Callum's other side, with the specific proximity of someone who was doing his own assessment and was doing it close enough to get good information. She was aware of this and did not comment on it. Let him look. That was what they had come for. At the corner. waiting for a light. She looked sideways at Seb and found him looking not at Callum, but at her. He held the look for a moment. In that look, she truly saw that he was okay. He was doing the difficult thing of being in a situation he had wanted, but which proved more complicated than he expected. He was okay. She had raised him to be okay with complicated things. Life was full of them, and the capacity to stay present without being destroyed was one of the most important things she knew how to teach and had taught since they were small. The capacity was holding. The coffee shop was warm and not crowded. A table in the back corner was far enough from the nearest customers to allow conversation without careful modulation. She ordered tea. Callum ordered coffee. Nico ordered nothing. Seb ordered a hot chocolate, which was the first entirely 12-year-old thing either of them had done since the morning began. And she loved him for it. They sat down. The table was rectangular. She sat at one end, Callum at the other, and the boys on either side. It wasn't the configuration any of them had planned, but it arranged itself from the geometry of 4 people with specific things they needed from each other. She looked at Callum. He looked at her. The boys looked at various things, Nico at the table surface. Seb at Callum, with the specific steadiness of someone who had made a decision to observe without interrupting. "I have questions," Seb said. Everyone looked at him. He was holding his hot chocolate with both hands, and he was looking at Callum with the direct, unmanaged quality of a 12-year-old who had decided that the available time was insufficient for the amount of indirection adults usually required. "I think we all have questions," he said, "and some of them are easier than others. Can we start with the easier ones?" Callum looked at him. Something in his expression shifted, not amusement exactly, but the specific quality of a person encountering something that was exactly what they needed without having been able to name it. "Yes," he said. "What's the easiest one?" Seb thought for a moment. "What do you do?" he said. "I know what the company does. I read about it. But what do you do? Specifically. Like, what's a Tuesday?" She watched Callum process this. She watched him for a long second, then waited. It was the thing she had not expected and would need time to understand. He engaged with the question as if it were genuine and deserving of a careful, honest, fully considered answer at length. He was not performing patience with a child. He was talking to someone who had asked something genuine, and he was responding genuinely. He described a Tuesday, not the polished version, not the press release version, the actual Tuesday, with its meetings and its decisions and the specific recurring problems that showed up in any organization of that size and had to be managed and sometimes solved and sometimes just contained. He talked for 4 minutes, and Seb listened with the complete attention he brought to things that interested him. When Callum finished, Seb nodded once. The small nod he used when he'd received information he could work with. "Nico's question is harder," Seb said. Everyone looked at Nico. He looked up from the table surface. He had been processing something. She could see it. The specific internal work that he did when he was organizing a question that mattered. "I've been thinking about how to ask this for a year," Nico said. "So I want to make sure I ask it right." He looked at Callum. "If you had known if the documents didn't exist, if your grandfather hadn't arranged the payment, if my mother had been able to reach you when she was trying to, what would you have done?" The coffee shop around them continued its Saturday morning business. The specific warmth of a heated room in November. The sound of the espresso machine. A conversation at the nearest table about something that had nothing to do with them. She held the question in the air with him, and she did not look at Callum because the question was Nico's, and the answer was for Nico, and she was not part of this specific exchange. Callum was quiet for a moment. She heard him take a breath. She heard him consider, heard it in the quality of the silence, which was not the silence of someone performing consideration, but the silence of someone who was actually doing it. "I don't know," Callum said. I want to give you a better answer than that, and I don't have one. I know who I was at 26, and I know what I had built with your mother, and I know that I was not someone who would have chosen to walk away from that kind of someone like her. He paused. But I also know I didn't look hard enough when the story I was given didn't make sense. And I don't know what I would have done at 26 with information that complicated my life significantly. Because I didn't get to be that person. I got to be the other version. He looked at Nico steadily. I'm not going to make you a promise about the person I would have been. I'll tell you what I can promise about the person I am now. Nico looked at him. The look had the quality of a 12-year-old doing something that required 12 years of practice, holding a difficult piece of information without reaching immediately for what to do with it. Okay, he said. What can you promise? That I'm going to be present. Not in the way that's convenient for me or that fits neatly into whatever I was doing before today. Present the way it actually costs something. Because I owe you that, and your mother that, and I understand why I owe it. He paused. And that I'm not going to make this about what I need. I have things I need from this too. And I have a lot to understand, and a lot to be honest about. But I'm not going to make those things your problem. Nico was quiet for a moment. He looked at his hot chocolate mug, which was empty, and then at Seb, and then back at Callum. Okay, he said again. And then, thank you for coming back into the cathedral. Thank you for being there, Callum said. I know how much it would have cost to come. It cost our mum more, Seb said. Not accusatory, factual. The way Seb was factual. She's the one who had to decide to let us come. Callum looked at her. She looked back at him. She said, They asked. I said yes. That's all. That's not all, Seb said. But okay. She almost smiled. He saw it. Something in his expression acknowledged it, a small, specific acknowledgement that was not a smile itself, but was the thing that preceded one in a person who had learned to manage their expressions in public spaces and who was, in this specific moment, finding that management slightly insufficient. They sat in the coffee shop for an hour. Not the full account. The full account was going to take longer than 1 hour and was going to require a different kind of space. But the beginning of it, those were the questions you could handle in an hour. 4 people who'd been moving at speed all morning needed the pause of a table, warm drinks, and the permission to speak at their own pace for it. She said some of the questions. He said some. Nico and Seb asked most of them, and also answered some of their own, in the way of people who had been thinking about a thing long enough that the thinking had arrived at conclusions they were ready to share. When the hour was complete, not by the clock, but by the quality of the conversation, the specific feeling of a first session, having done what a first session could do, Nico looked at her with the expression that asked, What's next? She looked at Callum. I think we should exchange numbers, she said, and I think you should come back when things are less, when you've had some time to sort out what today means for everything else. She meant Isolde. He understood she meant Isolde. He nodded. Yes, he said. There are things I need to sort out. He looked at the boys. Is that okay with you two? That we stop here for today and continue later? It's not a movie, Nico said. It doesn't have to resolve in one session. No, Callum said. It doesn't. They put numbers in phones. She and Callum stood on the sidewalk outside the coffee shop. The boys waited a few feet away. The quiet tact of people who understood some things needed privacy. I'm sorry, Callum said, for the specific shape of what happened and for not asking more questions and for the 12 years. I'm sorry too, she said, for the assumptions I made about you. They were reasonable assumptions. So were yours. They stood on the sidewalk in the November cold. The situation felt too large for either of them to say more right now. She had been here before. It was the start of things too large to see all at once. Things that had to be approached in parts and couldn't be treated as if the first part were the whole. She had built buildings that worked. She had built a life that worked. She had, for 12 years, built the specific version of a family that was available to her. And she had built it well, whatever this was, whatever the next version looked like. She would have to build it with the same care and honesty. She had to be willing to start without knowing the finished thing and put the pieces together as she went. She had always been good at that. She was going to have to trust that. "Call when you're ready," she said. "I will," he said. She turned and walked to her sons. She put her arms around both of them for a moment, not a performance of comfort. Just the specific physical fact of her arms around her sons on a November morning after the morning they had just had. They both leaned into it briefly and then stepped back, which was the right amount. She looked at them. They looked at her. "Okay," Seb said. "Okay," she said. "Let's go home." They walked. She did not look back at the cathedral. She kept her eyes on the street ahead, on the November morning, on the two boys beside her who were her sons and who had done something enormous and necessary and right. And she thought about what came next, the way she thought about the first day of a new project, with the specific combination of fear and readiness that was the honest version of beginning. The train home was the 2 train. It took 23 minutes from the stop nearest the cathedral to the stop nearest their apartment. She sat between her sons on the plastic bench seats, and she looked at the city going past the windows, the November version of it. The gray and purposeful city that did not slow down for personal reckonings, and she thought about the morning in the specific way she thought about things immediately after. Not yet processing, just holding, allowing the shapes of it to be present before she began to organize. Beside her, Nico had his earbuds in, which was his version of private time in shared spaces. He was not listening to music. She knew this because the specific quality of his attention was outward rather than inward, tracking the window and the stations and the other passengers rather than turned toward whatever was playing. He used the earbuds as a signal more than as an audio tool. It was his way of saying he needed private time and would speak when he was ready. She had always respected this. She respected it now. Seb had his head leaning against the window. Not asleep, his eyes were open, tracking something outside. He had the particular stillness he reached after significant things. The stillness that looked like depletion, but was actually the specific quiet of someone who had been fully present for an extended period and was now simply resting in the having been present. She knew this too. She had been watching him be himself for 12 years, and she knew his stillnesses the way she knew her own. She thought about Callum's face when he had said times, "I didn't know about them. Either of you." She had believed him. Not because she wanted to. Wanting was not the relevant variable here, but because the specific quality of his face in that moment was the quality of a person saying something that was true and that was costing them something to say. She had spent 34 years watching people tell truths and lies, and she could usually tell the difference. Not perfectly, but with steady reliability. She had also believed him about the photograph. "I kept one too." He had said it without emphasis or show, in the plain tone of someone telling a fact, because the conversation needed it. The line sounded true. She had been 22 years old in that photograph. She had been completely there, and he had been completely there. And someone had decided that there was more valuable to them in pieces than whole. She felt that anger at a distance, not the hot anger of the moment, which had had 12 years to cool into something structural. It was a colder recognition that she had been managed. It was not useful anger. It was not a direction. It was just a thing that was true about what had happened. She thought about Graham Vane. She thought about her father in the way she had been thinking about her father for 3 years, with the specific, complicated grief of someone who had loved an inadequate person and had known they were inadequate and had found that knowing and loving were not, apparently, mutually exclusive. She had been angry at him when she found the bank statement. She had been angry for 6 months, which was about as long as she could maintain active anger at someone who was dead and could not hear it. She had arrived. Eventually, at the specific sad acceptance that her father had been a person who made choices in his own interests and called the choices necessity, and that this had been true his entire life, and that he was dead, and that being angry at him was her business to manage, and not Callum Drexel's and not her son's. At the third stop, Nico took out an earbud and looked at her. "Are you okay?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Are you?" "I think so." He looked at the window for a moment. "He's not what I expected." "What did you expect?" He thought about it. "I don't know. Less there. More performing." He put the earbud back in. She thought about what less there and less performing meant from Nico, who was precise in his assessments and did not use words casually. She thought about Callum in the cathedral doorway, saying times, "Wait, please," times, and about Callum going to Isolde and coming back, and about Callum in the coffee shop not performing patience with her sons, but actually talking to them. She thought about the question Nico had asked, times what would you have done, times, and about Callum's answer, which had been times I don't know, and I won't pretend I know. But here's what I can tell you about now. She thought about what Nico had made of that answer, and she thought he had probably made the same thing she had, that the honesty about not knowing was more trustworthy than a confident answer would have been. Seb, without moving from the window position, said, "He has your hands." She looked at him. He was looking at his own hands, which were on his knees. "What?" "The way he holds things. His hands do the same thing yours do." He glanced at her. "It's weird to see things that are him in me. I knew it was going to happen. Still weird. That's going to take some getting used to," she said. "Yeah." He looked back at the window. "Also, he's really tall. You're going to be tall too." "I know." It was still a surprise to see it like that. She put her hand over his for a moment, the way she did when words wouldn't do. He turned his hand palm up. He held hers for 3 seconds and then let go, which was the right amount. At home, Daria was in the kitchen. She had let herself in with the spare key she'd had for 7 years and made tea. She was sitting at the table with a book she set down when they came in. She looked at Sarah. She looked at the boys. She looked back at Sarah with the look she used when she needed to know without asking. "It was okay," Sarah said. "Better than okay. A lot happened. Good, better. Or complicated, better. Complicated, better." Daria nodded. She stood and hugged Sarah briefly, and then went to the kitchen. She began making more tea. The specific way Daria offered help, not asking what was needed, but doing what was most needed while you sorted the rest out. Nico went to his room. Seb sat at the kitchen table and took out his phone. He did something on it for a few minutes, and then set it face down the way he did when he had handled the thing and was ready to leave it alone. Later, when the boys were in their room, and Daria was on the couch, and the apartment had settled into its Saturday evening version of itself. Sarah sat at the kitchen table with her tea, and she thought about the next thing. Not the whole thing. The whole thing was too large to think about all at once. Just the next thing. The next thing was Callum was going to call. When he did, she was going to need to have decided what she wanted from the conversation, and from the broader thing, the conversation was the beginning of. She was going to need to be honest about what she could offer and what she couldn't, and what the boys needed and what her own needs were. She was going to have to do all of this without the specific clarity she usually had when she began something, because for once, she genuinely did not know what the finished version looked like. This was, she thought, not entirely different from the best kinds of design challenges. The ones where you walked into a space and the space told you things you hadn't expected, and you had to let the things be true, even if they revised the plan you came in with. The ones where the building pushed back, and you listened to the pushing. She picked up her tea. She thought about what she was building. She did not know yet. She was going to have to find out. She was good at finding out. She had always been good at finding out. Outside the kitchen window, the November evening was settling in the way of November evenings, early and committed. The specific dark of a city that had turned toward winter. The lights of the building across the street were warm in their windows, somewhere 2 blocks north and east. A cathedral was finishing whatever reception had been planned for the evening. Or maybe not finishing it. She didn't know and didn't need to know. Somewhere, Callum Drexel was processing a day that had reorganized everything he understood about his own recent history. And that processing was his to do, and she was going to let him do it. She had her tea. She had her kitchen. She had her sons. Asleep, or nearly asleep, in the room down the hall. They had done something difficult and right, and had come home from it steady. She had Daria on the couch. She had the specific, earned calm of a person who has been through a hard thing and is out the other side and is still here and still herself. She was still herself. That was the thing she had always needed to know. And she knew it. Callum Drexel spent the Sunday after his wedding in an apartment that was now technically his and Isolde's, and that contained, in the particular quality of its silence, the specific shape of 2 people who needed to have a conversation they had not yet fully had. They had started it Saturday night. He had come back from the coffee shop, back from the sidewalk outside. Back from the walk with 2 12-year-old boys who had his face, and Isolde had been in the apartment, changed out of the wedding dress, sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of wine and the specific posture of someone who had been waiting in the way that people waited when they understood that waiting was the only thing available and were doing it well. He had sat across from her. He had told her everything, the conference room on Monday, the documents, the payment to Graham Vane, the 12 years of wrong information. He had told it completely, without management, without the professional instinct he had spent 15 years developing to give information in its most useful rather than its most complete form. He gave it complete. She deserved complete. She had listened. She was very good at listening. It was one of the things he had always respected about her. The genuine quality of her attention when something required attention. She had not interrupted. When he finished, she had asked 3 questions, all of them specific, none of them about her own position in what he had described. The first question, did he know what he was going to do about the boys? The second, did he know what he wanted from Sarah? The third, did he understand what he was asking of her? He had answered all 3 honestly. No, he didn't know, yet he knew what he was obligated to do, which was to be present and consistent and honest. And he knew he was going to do it. But the specific shape of what that looked like in practice required conversations he had not yet had. He didn't know what he wanted from Sarah. He knew he wanted to understand what 12 years had actually been, and he knew he owed her an apology that was real rather than performative. And beyond that, he was not going to claim to know things he didn't know. And yes, he understood what he was asking of her. He understood that he was asking her to be married to a man who had just discovered he had 2 children with someone else, whose wedding she had attended, and who was going to need to build relationships with those children that would inevitably take up space in their shared life. He understood that this was an enormous ask and that she had not known. When she said yes to the question he had asked her 14 months ago, that this was what she was saying yes to. What do you want? He had said. From this, from us. She had been quiet for a long time. He had waited. She was not a person who required prompting when she was thinking she required space, and he gave it. I want honesty, she had said finally. From here forward. No more. I understand that what happened wasn't your deception. It was your grandfather's and Graham Vane's. But I want to be someone you tell things to when things happen, not after. Not when you've already decided. When? Yes, he said. I can do that. And I need some time, she said, to decide what I want from the rest of it. Not a year, but time. Yes, he said. And Callum. She had looked at him steadily. The boys. Whatever I decide about us, the boys are your sons, and you're going to be their father. And I'm not going to be a reason that doesn't happen. I want you to know that. He had looked at her. He had thought about what it meant that this was the thing she was most certain about, not her own position, not what she needed, but that she was not going to be an obstacle to something right. He had thought about what kind of person committed to that first, as the starting point, before negotiating anything else. Thank you, he said. They had not resolved anything else that night. They had gone to sleep in the same bed, separately, and not touching. It was unfamiliar and right for that night. In the morning she had gone to her sister's, and he had stayed in the apartment and done the work of understanding what the next week needed to look like. The next week needed to look like this. He needed to call his attorney and begin the process of documenting his relationship to Nico and Seb. Not legally. That was going to be a much longer conversation and was going to require Sira's involvement and possibly legal representation on her side, but personally, in the sense of having the record straight, having the facts of who knew what and when clearly established. He needed to talk to the board of Drexel Holdings about the specific implications of the estate settlement. The settlement had documents that would need handling, and he was not planning to bring up the personal dimensions. He needed to have the conversation with Isolde that was the larger version of the one they had started Saturday night. The conversation that would take days rather than one evening, and he needed to call Sarah. He called Sarah on Monday, 2 days after Saturday. He thought that timing was soon enough to show the commitment was real, but not so soon that he arrived before she had time to decide what she wanted from the conversation. She said, on the 4th ring, "Callum, Sarah." He was in the window of his home office, looking at the city. "Is this a good time?" "It's fine. The boys are at school. I wanted to call to say that, to say several things. Actually, the first is that I've been in touch with my attorney about the estate documents, and everything that was done by my grandfather is going to be part of the official record. It's not going to be. I'm not going to let it be buried again." She was quiet for a moment. "Okay," she said. "The second thing is that I understand if you need time to decide what the relationship looks like going forward. I'm not going to push for a specific form or a specific timeline, but I want the boys to know that I'm available. Whatever available looks like in practice, I'm leaving that to you and to them. They're 12. They know what they need." "They do," she said. "The third thing is," he stopped. He had prepared this, or had tried to, and found in the preparation that the prepared version was insufficient. He said it without the preparation. "I'm sorry that you raised them alone for 12 years. I'm sorry you had to do that without. I'm sorry you were denied the option of doing it differently. I know an apology isn't the relevant currency here, and I'm not offering it as currency. I'm offering it as a true thing that I need to say." The line was quiet for a moment. He heard her breathing, which was the specific sound of someone who was receiving something they needed to receive, but were not going to receive sentimentally. "I know," she said. "I believe you. Can I ask something?" "Yes." "How did you do it?" he said. 12 years alone with them. They're extraordinary. Sira, they're two of the most Nico's precision, and Seb's the way he said what he said in the cathedral. The way they both held themselves through the whole morning." He paused. "You did that." She was quiet for a moment. When she said the next thing, the quality of her voice was slightly different. Not soft, exactly, but less managed, in the way of someone who has been given a form of credit that they did not realize they needed. "I had help," she said. "Daria, my friend." She's been there the entire time. And the boys helped each other. They're very much each other's people. Those two. They always have been. They clearly are, he said. And I. She paused. I had them. Which sounds simple. But it's not simple. Having them meant I always knew exactly what mattered. Even when everything else was unclear. They were the orientation point. A brief quiet. They still are. He stood at the window of his home office and held on to the thought. He thought about what she had built and what it had cost and what had made the cost bearable. And he thought about what it meant that the thing that had made it bearable was also the thing that was now the bridge between them. The boys were the orientation point for both of them. Now, he was going to have to build toward that, toward being the kind of person who deserved to have that in common with her. I want to meet them properly, he said. Not in the middle of everything, like Saturday, when the dust has settled enough that we can when there's space for it to be more ordinary. If that's possible. That's possible, she said. Give it a few weeks. Let things settle. Nico is going to want information. First he'll have questions, probably a lot of them. And he's going to want to do some reading and research before he's ready to sit across a table and have them answered. Seb is going to want to see where you live. He'll want the specific physical reality of your life, the way it actually looks, before he knows how to place you. I know exactly what they need, he said, before he could stop himself. A small pause. You do. Nico's the way he uses information as preparation, the way he gathers before he engages, and Seb's the physical orientation, needing to see and touch the actual thing before it becomes real for him. Another small pause, and in it, something different, the specific quality of someone reconsidering a variable. How do you know that? She said. From Saturday morning. I paid attention, he said, to how they moved through the cathedral and how they sat and how they asked their questions. He paused. I pay attention when things matter. Yes, she said. After a moment, I know you do. The conversation moved into more practical territory, logistics, tentative timing. What the boys had said when she talked to them Sunday evening. Nico had asked for Callum's professional email address, which she found both exactly like him and unexpectedly moving. Seb had asked what kind of car Callum drove, which was also exactly like him. She told Callum both of these things, and he wrote down the questions and said he would answer them when the time was right. She gave him Nico's email address. He gave her his direct line. They talked for 22 minutes. When the conversation ended, she said, I'll be in touch when the boys are ready. It won't be long. Okay, he said. Sarah. Yes, thank you for letting them come Saturday. For the whole thing. They asked. She said. I said yes. I know. But you could have said no. A brief pause. Yes, she said. I could have. After the call, he sat in the home office for a while. He thought about what he had just said times I pay attention when things matter times, and he thought about what that implied, which was that there were things he had not paid attention to because he had not known they mattered, which was itself a form of failure even if it was not intentional. He thought about the specific way in which his grandfather's management of the situation had cost him not just Sarah, but the 12 years, the specific person he would have been if the 12 years had gone differently. The specific understanding of himself as a father that he was only now beginning to access. He thought about being 38 and only now learning something he should have had the chance to learn at 26. He thought about Nico. Nico had spent 11 months researching his father with the patient. Methodical care of someone who understood that carefully gathered information mattered more than quickly gathered facts. He thought about Seb, who had stood up in the cathedral and said times, I'm sorry to interrupt. My name is Sebastian Vane, and I wanted you to know that we're here. He thought I don't deserve them yet, and then I'm going to deserve them. The specific difference between those two statements was the work of the next period of his life. He was clear on it. And clarity was where he always started. It was the thing he had always been good at, arriving at clarity and then moving from it. He had arrived. He was going to move. The full conversation with Isolde happened on Tuesday. She came back from her sister's and they sat in the kitchen, not the office. Not the formal spaces that were organized for professional purposes. The kitchen, which was the place that didn't have an agenda built into its architecture, and they talked for 3 hours. He told her everything that he understood. It was more complete than what he had told her Saturday night, because 48 hours had given him the space to understand more of it. She told him what she was thinking, which was also more complete than Saturday night. For the same reason. What she was thinking that she needed to understand what kind of marriage she had agreed to. Given that the information available when she agreed was materially incomplete, she was thinking that she respected what he was doing with respect to the boys and did not want to interfere with it. She was thinking that the question of what they were to each other, going forward. It was a question she was not ready to answer yet, and that she needed him to be willing to hold the question open while she arrived at the answer. "I can do that," he said. "I know you can," she said. "That's not the hard part. The hard part is doing it without pressuring me, not obviously, not intentionally, but in the way that happens when someone is waiting for you to make a decision they care about the outcome of. Can you do that too?" He thought about this honestly. "I'll try," he said. "If I fail at it, I'd like you to tell me." "I will." She looked at her coffee. "I'm not going anywhere yet. I want to be clear about that. I'm staying in this apartment, and I'm thinking about what I want, and I'm going to take the time that takes, and in the meantime, things are going to be what they are." She looked at him. "But I need to know that you're not waiting for me to decide, so that you can move on to what you actually want." "I'm not waiting," he said. "I don't know what I actually want yet. I know what I'm obligated to, and what I'm going to do regardless. The rest is—" He stopped. He was honest. "The rest is also something I need time for." She nodded. The nod had the quality of acceptance rather than approval. It acknowledged that this was where they were, that the situation was complicated, that the complication was real, and that it was not going to resolve itself quickly. He accepted the same thing from his side. They sat in the kitchen with their coffee and the November morning outside the window. They lived with the specific difficulty of two people trying to be honest about something that had no clean lines. He emailed Nico. She said, before the conversation ended, from his personal email, a list of 7 things Nico would probably want to know about him. Professional background, a few personal things. He said to take his time responding. Isolde looked at him. "You emailed a 12-year-old last night." "This morning," he said. "He sent me his email address through his mother. I wanted him to have information in the format that works for him. Before we meet in person." She looked at him for a moment, with an expression he couldn't entirely read. Then she said, "He sounds like you." "Yes," Callum said. "He does." The email to Nico had taken 40 minutes to write. He wrote 4 drafts before he landed on a tone that was neither too formal nor performing warmth he hadn't earned. And that didn't overwhelm with detail or withhold genuinely useful information. He had settled on 7 items, his professional background, briefly, the things he built, and why he found them important, the places he had lived, 2 things he was bad at and had always been bad at, 2 things he had learned to do well that had not come naturally, and a question. At the end, 1 question. Specific. That said, "Times I've told you some things about me. Is there something specific you want to know that I haven't covered?" He did not know if the email was right. He knew it was honest, which was the only quality he could guarantee. He had sent it, and he was going to find out. On Thursday, 4 days after the Saturday, Nico replied. The reply was 4 sentences, which was 4 sentences more than Callum had known to expect or hope for. It said Times. Thank you for the email. The two things you said you were bad at are both things I'm also bad at, which is interesting. The question I want to ask is whether you understand why the thing you built with my mother mattered, or whether you thought it was one kind of thing at the time and have revised your understanding since. I ask because I think the answer matters, and I'd like to know it before we meet. Callum sat with Nico's email for 20 minutes. He thought about the question, its specific clarity, and how it left no room for a vague answer. It went straight to the core thing you need to know about a person, whether they have the honesty to answer. He thought, he's 12 years old, and he is asking the question I needed to ask 12 years ago, and didn't. He thought he learned that from his mother. He wrote back. The reply was longer than the email. He said the question directly, without performing either self-criticism or self-defense, with the specific honesty that the question required. Yes, he understood now what it had mattered. And no, he had not fully understood it at the time. He explained what he had understood then and how his understanding had changed since. And he said the change was real and not performed. He could not prove it through words, but intended to demonstrate it through what he did going forward. If Nico was willing to allow the demonstration, he sent it. He waited. Nico's reply arrived 6 hours later. It was 3 words times. Okay, that's fair. Callum looked at the 3 words for a long time. He looked at them, and he thought about what 12 years had built, in both of them, and about what the next period was going to require, and about what he had said to Seb in the coffee shop times. I'm not going to make those things your problem. He thought about whether he was capable of actually doing that, of doing the thing that required him to be consistently present in the way that cost something rather than in the way that was convenient. He thought he was capable. He thought the capability was not yet the same as the doing, and that the doing was going to take time and consistency and the willingness to fail occasionally and to own the failing honestly. He thought all of this, and then he thought, start. He opened a new email window. He wrote, Times Sarah. Nico and I have been emailing. He's remarkable. I wanted you to know that, and also to ask. What would be the right way to ask him and Seb if they want to meet for lunch in the next few weeks? I'm asking you first, because it's your family, and I don't want to go around you. But I'd like to ask, if you think the time is right. He sent it. He closed the laptop. He went to the window and looked at the November city. The city he had lived in his entire adult life. It felt slightly different now, with a different geography and 2 new points of reference that had not been there before Saturday. He stood at the window and thought about Sarah at the corner, her coat buttoned against the November cold. She stood watching the cathedral doors, waiting to see if her sons would be okay. He thought about what it cost to stand there and wait rather than to go in. He thought about the specific quality of her face when she had walked toward them on the sidewalk. She had not been walking toward him. She had been walking toward her sons, and he had been an element she managed without letting it derail her. He thought about Nico's face when she had put her arms around both of them, the relaxation of someone for whom that presence was the most basic kind of safety. He thought about what 12 years of being that kind of safety looked like, what it had required, what it had built. He thought she is extraordinary. And then I have known this for 12 years and 9 months. And then I am going to have to earn the right to know it for 12 years and 9 months. In the specific way that earning rights works, which is by doing the thing rather than by claiming it. He stood at the window until the November city had fully committed to dark. Then he went to the kitchen and made dinner. He thought about what came next and decided he would make it what he wanted. Sarah's reply to the email arrived the next morning. It was brief. She had always been brief when brevity was sufficient, and it said, Times, talk to them yourself. They have your email now. I think it's right that the invitation comes directly from you. I'll be here if they want to talk through how they feel about it. But the invitation should be yours. He looked at this for a moment. She was right. She was also giving him the chance to do it directly rather than through her. The proper way to build a relationship and, given the history, a form of trust she was letting him earn. He opened an email to Nico. He wrote, "Times I'd like to invite you and Seb to lunch. When you're ready. Not a formal thing wherever you want. Whatever feels right to you. No pressure on timing. Just let me know when it works." He sent it. He opened a second window. He wrote to Seb's email, which Sierra had sent him after Nico had shared his, and wrote times, "Same message to you as to your brother. Lunch. When you're ready. Wherever works. I'll let you two decide." He paused. Then he added times, "For what it's worth. I drive a 2019 black Range Rover. I know you asked." He sent that one too. He sat back from the desk. He thought, that's the right amount. Not too much. Not managing the situation. Not performing. Just the facts and the offer. Seb replied within 3 hours. He suspected that meant Seb had been checking his email more often than usual, which was its own kind of information. The reply said times, "Next Saturday works. Can we see where you live? Mom says we should meet somewhere public, and I agree, but I also want to see where you live at some point. The Range Rover is a good car." He almost laughed. He had not laughed much in the week since Saturday. Seb's email produced something close to a laugh. An involuntary relaxation at encountering something both unexpected and exactly right. He said to Seb, and copied Nico times, "Next Saturday, I can meet you at the building where my office is, not to do anything professional, just as a place to start. And then lunch nearby. After that, if you want to see the apartment, that's also possible. Text me when you know what time works." Nico's reply came 20 minutes after Seb's initial email. It was times Seb already answered. "Saturday, at 11. Your building. We'll find the address. Is there anything you want us to know before we meet?" He thought about this question. He thought about what it was asking, not what questions Nico had, but what Callum wanted them to know. The specific generosity of a 12-year-old who was making space for the other person's perspective before their own. He wrote times, "One thing. I'm going to make mistakes in this. Not the kind I've already made. Those I understand clearly, and I'm not going to repeat them. The kind where I'm learning how to do something I haven't done before. And the learning process involves getting things wrong sometimes. I wanted to say that in advance so it doesn't surprise you when it happens." Nico replied times, "That's fair. We'll probably do that too." He put the phone down. He stood up from the desk and went to the window and stood there looking at the November city, which was what he did when he needed to think and not type. He had 2 sons coming to his office building on Saturday, then to his apartment for lunch. They would ask him things he would not always know how to answer, and he would have to learn to be a father in real time with 12-year-olds, who already had their own personalities and ways of being, and who would require consistent honesty about what he knew and what he did not. He had never been a father. For 12 years he had not been a father by someone else's arrangement. Now that arrangement had been dissolved, and the reality had arrived. The reality was 2 people with their own needs, and a trust he would have to earn by doing the things that earn trust. He was not afraid of this. He was, in the specific way that he was, with things that mattered and were difficult, entirely committed. The week between the Saturday and the next Saturday was both long and full. He met with his attorney twice and briefed the Drexel Holdings legal team on the specific contents of the estate documents that had been found. He had a conversation with the board chair, a conversation he had been dreading, and that turned out to be less terrible than the dread had indicated. In the way of things that were difficult in anticipation and merely hard in practice. He had 2 more long evenings with Isolde that were honest and difficult and not resolved, but were moving in a direction that felt real rather than performed. He emailed Nico twice more with answers to questions Nico sent. The emails were short and specific, and felt, in their back-and-forth quality, like the beginning of something that had a rhythm. He thought about Sarah on Wednesday. Specifically, he thought about her most days, in the way of someone who has reorganized their understanding of 12 years, and who finds that the person at the center of the reorganization is present in thought, in a way that is not nostalgia, but is also not nothing. He thought about her on Wednesday because on Wednesday he was reviewing drawings for a restoration project, a 19th century warehouse conversion in Brooklyn. The kind of project that was complicated and interesting, and that he had been involved in since the preliminary stages, and he found himself applying a way of thinking about the space that he recognized from 12 years ago as something she had said, not a technique, a framework, a way of understanding what a building needed rather than what it was supposed to become. He had heard her say it in Boston, at the panel, before he knew who she was, and he had been thinking in that framework ever since, without having tracked where it came from. He thought she'd been in my work for 12 years and I never noticed. He thought she probably had been. He thought that when someone shows you something true, it stays. On Friday, he went to the apartment where Nico and Seb had lived their entire lives. Not to go in, he was not going in. That was not where they were, but to walk the block, to see what the neighborhood looked like, what the building looked like, what the specific geography of 12 years of their lives was. He walked the block twice and looked at the building from across the street. It was a 5-story pre-war building with a good facade and, from the outside, what looked like decent north-facing light in the upper floors. He thought about Sarah choosing this building, about the specific considerations she would have brought to the choice, and about the boys growing up in it and what it meant that they had grown up well. He walked back to the subway. He thought about Saturday. Saturday arrived with the specific quality of something long awaited, not as dramatic in the arrival as the anticipation had made it seem, but simply real and present. He was at his building at 10:40, at 11. Nico and Seb came through the lobby. They had taken the subway. They had navigated the lobby security, a process that required the specific self-possession of people who were certain they were expected, which they had, and so the guard only confirmed their name. He met them in the lobby. They were in good coats, the same ones from the wedding. They carried the same earned look they had in the cathedral, the kind people get when they've prepared themselves and done the work for what they're about to face. "Hi," Seb said. "Hi," Callum said. Nico looked at the lobby, which was the specific looking he did when he was taking a space in, rather than just passing through it. "Nice building," he said. "It was a 1920s office building," Callum said. "We did a significant restoration about 6 years ago. The ground floor atrium is original." Nico looked at the atrium. He looked at it with genuine attention. "The light is good," he said. "Your mother's influence," Callum said. "I've been paying attention to light in buildings since Boston." Nico looked at him. The look had the quality of someone receiving information they had not expected and were deciding where to file it. She would say, "That's the right thing to pay attention to," he said. "She would be right," Callum said. "She usually is, about things like that." Seb, who had been looking at the elevator bank, turned around. "Are we going up?" "If you want." "I want," Seb said. They went up. Sarah's phone rang at 11:47. She had been watching the coffee shop door for 40 minutes. An action she knew wasn't rational, but couldn't stop. The door was where information would appear. And she was the kind of person who preferred to face the source of news rather than turn away. She had drunk 1 cup of coffee and ordered a second, and was halfway through the second when Nico's name appeared on her screen. "Hi," she said. "He's real," Nico said. She sat with this for a moment. in her experience of her son, when he said something that sounded simple. It was usually the most accurate version of something complex. "I know," she said. No, I mean a pause in which she could hear him organizing his thoughts in the specific way he did, which was the way of someone who took language seriously. He looked at us the way you'd look at something you'd been thinking about for a very long time, and suddenly it's in front of you and it's different from the thinking, but it's also exactly what you thought. That kind of real. She pressed the phone against her ear and looked at the street outside the coffee shop window. "Where are you now?" "Still in the cathedral." "Seb is..." Another pause. "Mom." Seb stood up. "I know. He texted me. Are you okay?" She had received the text from Seb 17 minutes ago. Times I stood up. "I just said our names. I didn't say anything else. Come get us if you need to." She had read it 3 times and had not responded yet, because she had been trying to determine what her response actually was. "I'm okay," she said. "Is Seb okay?" "He's very calm. Actually, he's sitting here looking like he just completed a project." This sounded correct. Seb approached most things as projects and had the specific quality of someone who experienced completion as a settling rather than an excitement. "Tell him not to do anything else," she said. "Both of you just wait." "We're waiting," Nico said. "But Mum, yes." He came and found us. After. He came to where we were sitting and he looked at us and he said, the pause this time was longer. He said, "Wait for me." And then he went back to talk to the woman, the one he was supposed to marry. Sarah looked at the surface of the coffee table. She thought about what times "wait for me" times meant, and what kind of person said it, and whether the person who said it was the person she had known or a different version entirely. What happened after he talked to her? He left. He left the cathedral. A beat. "I think he's looking for you." She exhaled slowly. "I'll come to you. You don't have to." "I'm coming." She was already standing, reaching for her jacket with the automatic efficiency of someone in motion. "Stay in the cathedral. Don't talk to anyone else. I'll be there in 4 minutes." She paid and left and walked faster than she would normally walk. Not running, but with the specific velocity of someone who has been waiting for a thing and is now moving toward it. The November air was cold, and the street was doing its ordinary business around her, and she moved through it, thinking about times, "wait for me" times, and about the particular kind of person who could say that in the middle of their own wedding and mean it as an organizing principle rather than a delay. She had known the 26-year-old version of Callum Drexel, and the 26-year-old version had had that quality, the quality of someone who, when they decided something, organized themselves completely toward it. She had not known until now whether the 38-year-old version had kept it. She turned the corner and the cathedral was in front of her. She stood at the bottom of the steps for a moment, looking at the stone facade, which was enormous and deliberate in the way of buildings, designed to make you feel the weight of what happened inside them. She had designed a church once, small and community-based. Nothing like this, but she had thought carefully about what a building that held significant moments needed to communicate. And standing here, she thought, this building communicates permanence, and what is about to happen inside it might not be permanent, and the building does not know that yet. She went up the steps and through the door. The cathedral was mostly emptied of the wedding crowd. People had moved from confusion to murmuring to the specific activity of a social event, interrupted, gathering in clusters near the back and in the side aisles. The particular behavior of people who were not sure if they were still guests or witnesses or bystanders. She did not look at them. She walked down the center aisle toward the front pew, where Nico and Seb were sitting exactly where she had expected them to be, exactly where he had told her they would sit side by side with the specific composure of 2 people who had done what they set out to do and were now waiting for the next information. She sat down between them. She put one arm around each of them. She looked at the altar at the front of the cathedral, which was arranged for a wedding that had not been completed, and she thought, "Here we are." "He left," she said quietly. 2 minutes ago," Nico said, "through the side door." He paused. "I think he went to find you. He doesn't know where I am." "He will," Seb said. "He's the kind of person who finds things out." She looked at her son. She thought about where this particular quality of perception had come from and decided she was not going to examine that right now. "Probably," she said. They sat in the front pew of St. Anselm's Cathedral in the aftermath of an interrupted wedding, with murmuring guests and November light coming through the high windows. Sarah thought about the 12 years, not in the comprehensive way she sometimes reviewed them, with the specific, organized attention of a person trying to understand a complete picture. It was the immediate way you thought about something when you were sitting in the middle of its consequences, when the thinking was less about understanding and more about orienting. She thought, 12 years ago, I made decisions based on what I believed to be true. I believe now that some of what I believed was not actually true. What does that mean for the decisions? Her phone buzzed. An unknown number. She looked at the boys, who were looking at her in the way they looked when they were paying full attention, but were very carefully not offering an opinion. "It's Callum Drexel," the voice said. "I got your number from the wedding coordinator. I know that's an unusual way to get someone's number. And I apologize for the method. I'm outside St. Anselm's. I was told you might be inside." She looked at the high windows and the November light and the altar. She said, "We're inside. Front pew." Pause. "I'll come in." She lowered the phone. She looked at Seb, who had the expression she sometimes saw and refused to examine closely. The same look Callum Drexel had at 26 when he received unexpected information. She looked at Nico, who was looking at the door through which Callum was presumably about to enter. "Okay," she said to both of them. "Okay," Nico said. Seb said nothing, which was more informative. She heard the door. She heard footsteps. She did not turn around, because turning around required a decision she was not yet ready to make, which was the decision about what her face would look like when she saw him. She waited until the footsteps stopped, and then she turned. He was standing in the aisle 3 rows back, in a morning suit that had the quality of clothing put on for one occasion and worn through something else entirely. And he was looking at her with the specific expression of a person who has had 12 years of one story and has spent the last week learning that the story was wrong and is now standing in front of the person who can give them the true version. He looked tired. He looked like someone who had been processing things at speed for longer than was sustainable. He looked, beneath all of that, like the person she had known. She stood up. He walked forward until they were close enough to talk without the cathedral acoustics making the conversation a performance. And he stopped, and they looked at each other. Neither of them said the obvious thing because those things were too large for the moment, and both of them understood that large things needed to arrive slowly if they were going to arrive intact. "Hello, Sarah," he said. "Hello, Callum." A pause in which 12 years lived. She was aware of Nico and Seb behind her, of their stillness, of the specific quality of 2 people who were watching something important and who had decided to let it happen at its own pace. "I found the documents last week," he said. "In my grandfather's estate papers, the payment was made to your father, not to you." She looked at him. "I know," she said. "I found out 3 years after. He told me." Something moved across his face. "You found out 3 years," he stopped. He took a breath. "I didn't know the boys existed until he stopped again. I'm sorry. I'm saying this badly. I've been thinking about how to say this for 5 days and I'm still saying it badly." "You're saying it," she said. "That's the part that matters right now." He looked at her for a moment. He looked behind her at Nico and Seb. She watched him look at them with the specific quality she had seen when he came down the aisle, the particular way a person looked when they were recognizing something they had not been prepared to recognize, when the recognition required a kind of internal reorganization that happened faster than thought. "Can I?" He looked at her again. "Would you be willing to?" He stopped. He tried again. This time, without attempting to construct the full sentence first. "I would like to talk to you and to them, if that's possible. If that's something you're willing to do." She thought about the word willing. She thought about 12 years of organizing her life around the assumption of an answer she was no longer sure was accurate. She thought about 2 boys who had set up a Google alert and printed a wedding announcement, and sat in the front row of a cathedral, and one of them had stood up and said their names because it needed to be said. "Yes," she said, "we can talk." There was a coffee shop 2 blocks from the cathedral that had the quality of a place that existed to serve people who needed to not be in the place they had been. He had been in it 3 times in his life, all of them incidental, and now he was there for a 4th that was not, sitting across a table from Sarah Vane and her sons. He was acutely aware of both the smallness of the table and the enormity of what it was holding. Sarah had ordered tea. Nico had ordered hot chocolate. Seb had looked at the menu for a while and then said he'd have the same as Nico, which was the specific behavior of someone who was managing a lot of information and had decided not to add a beverage decision to the load. Callum had ordered coffee, which he would not drink, and he was grateful for the cup to hold. He looked at them. He had been looking at them since the cathedral, not staring or performing the look. He gave things that were genuinely important to him his full attention, rather than the partial allocation he used for most things. They looked like him. They looked, specifically, granularly, undeniably like him, in the way that biological facts presented themselves, regardless of whether you had been told about them. Nico was watching him with the assessment quality, the kind of look that was gathering information rather than making demands. Seb was watching him with the look he had worn in the cathedral, which was the look of someone who had done something requiring nerve and was now in the part after the nerve, which required a different quality. He looked at Sarah. She was looking at the table, which he understood was not absence, but organization. She was organizing what she wanted to say. And he had learned 12 years ago that she organized before she spoke, that the speaking was always downstream of a process he usually didn't see. He decided not to wait for the perfect version. The perfect version was not coming. He had already established in the cathedral that he would do this imperfectly rather than not at all. "I want to tell you what I knew and when," he said, not as an explanation, as information. "So you have the accurate version." Sarah looked up. She met his eyes and held them in the way she had always held things steadily, without drama. "All right," she said. He told them. He told it in order, which was the way he told things when the order mattered. He started with September of 12 years ago, the phone calls that had not been returned, his assumption that she had decided they were done, and then his grandfather's office and the document. He told them what the document had said. He told them what he had understood from it and what he had chosen to believe. He stopped where choice entered the picture. That was the place he needed to be honest about. "I could have questioned it," he said. "The document. The story. I could have tried to contact you directly and gotten a different answer than my grandfather gave me. I didn't. I believed what I was shown because it was easier to believe it than to," he paused, "than to sit with not knowing. I chose certainty over accuracy. That's on me. Not on my grandfather. Not on your father. The choice to accept what I was given without questioning it was mine." Sarah was quiet for a moment. Seb looked at Nico. Nico met his gaze directly. Callum watched the exchange and thought about what it meant to have someone who could communicate with you without speaking, someone who had been with you since before either of you could speak. I also chose to accept it. Sarah said, the story I had, that you had been given the opportunity to know and had chosen not to. She looked at the tea. It was easier than not knowing. Yes, he looked at her. We were both choosing easier. We were 26. Yes. He thought about 26 and what it had meant. He thought about what he would do differently at 38. A thought he set aside for now because it wasn't useful in this moment. Can I ask you something? She nodded. When you found out about your father, about the money, what did you think it meant? She was quiet for a moment. I thought it meant you'd known. That your family had paid to make the problem go away and that you'd let them. A pause. I stopped asking whether that was accurate, because asking would have required doing something with the answer, and I wasn't ready to do something with it. Fair, he said. Not particularly. She looked at him directly, but honest. He looked at Nico and Seb. Seb was looking at him with the complete attention he seemed to give to things he considered important, which was apparently most things. Nico was looking at the window, which Callum had already learned was not inattention, but the specific thinking position that Nico used when he was processing. I have questions. Seb said. Yes. Callum said. I imagine you do. Can I just ask them? Please. Seb looked at him with the directness he apparently brought to everything. Why didn't you look harder? After, when she stopped responding, Callum thought about this. He thought about it with the care it deserved, which was the same care he wished he had brought to the question 12 years ago. I was hurt, he said, and pride is a poor substitute for courage. I told myself that if she had wanted to be found, she would have made it possible. I was wrong about that, but it's what I told myself. He paused. The honest version is that I was afraid of what I might find if I looked harder, afraid she'd confirm that she'd chosen to go. And I couldn't. He stopped. He tried again. I couldn't face that possibility, so I stopped looking. Seb was quiet for a moment. Then, that makes sense. Nico turned from the window. It also wasn't enough. He said, both things are true. Yes, Callum said. Both things are true. Nico looked at him. The assessment quality was still there, but there was something under it now that had not been there before, which was the specific quality of someone who has been given an answer that is more complete than they expected and is now deciding what to do with the completeness. You said, wait for me in the cathedral. Yes. To us, specifically. Yes. What did you mean by it? He thought about what he had meant. He had meant it in the immediate sense, wait. Don't leave. I need to deal with what's in front of me before I can deal with what's in front of you. He had also meant it in a different way. And he was going to be honest about that, because these two people had come to a cathedral to see him, and they deserved honesty more than performance. I meant that you were more important than finishing the ceremony, he said, and I meant that I needed to do that part right. With Isolde, before I could do anything else, right. I couldn't walk out of one thing badly and into another thing well. It doesn't work like that. Nico looked at him for a moment. What happened with the woman? Isolde. We talked. I told her what I had found in the documents last week. I hadn't told her before because I was still trying to understand it myself. I told her what it meant. I told her I needed to stop the ceremony. He looked at his coffee. She was. He thought about how to say this accurately. She was upset. And then she was not surprised. And then she was upset about not being surprised, which is a more complicated thing. She and I are going to have a much longer conversation, and it is going to be difficult, and she deserves it to be done carefully. He looked up. I didn't walk out because I didn't care about her. I walked out because staying would have been dishonest to her, and to you, and to Sarah, and to myself. The only thing worse than the situation we were all in was the version of it where I made it worse by being a coward. The table was quiet. Through the window. The November city moved in its ordinary way, indifferent to the specific gravity of what was happening inside this coffee shop. Sarah was looking at him with an expression he could not fully read, which had always been true of her. She had never been entirely readable, had always been the kind of person who held more than she showed. And this had been part of what he had found remarkable about her at 26, and what he was finding remarkable again now. "What do you want?" she said. Not hostile, genuinely asking. He thought about the question, which was the right question and also the most difficult one. "I want to know them," he said. "I want to understand what I missed and what exists now and what's possible. I'm not going to pretend I have a plan. I have a direction." She looked at the boys. Seb was watching Callum with the expression he'd had since the cathedral, the completed project quality, overlaid now with something more complex that might have been hope, or might have been caution, or might have been both simultaneously. Nico was looking at Sarah. "Mom," Nico said. She looked at her son. "What do you want?" he said. He was asking her the same question Callum had asked, but from the inside of the situation rather than the outside of it. He was asking because he was a person who understood that his mother had needs that mattered, that the conversation had to include her, or it was incomplete. She looked at Callum. She looked at the tea she had not finished. She looked at the window and the November light. She said, "I want the true version, whatever it is, even if it's complicated. I'd rather have complicated and true than simple and wrong." Callum looked at her. "So would I," he said. "I've had simple and wrong for a long time." "Same," she said. And in saying that, not agreement about everything, but a mutual acknowledgement of the specific isolation of living with a story you hadn't been given all the information to understand something released in the conversation. Not resolved. Released. There was a difference, and she seemed to know it as much as he did. "I want to meet with them," he said, "properly. Not in a crisis, but in an ordinary setting. If you'd be willing to arrange that." He looked at her to ask permission, which felt like the right thing to do. "I understand that's entirely your decision." "It's ours," Nico said quietly. Callum looked at him. "Yes," he said, "it is." On the Saturday after the cathedral, they went to his building. Their mother dropped them off at the corner and gave them the specific look that said she trusted them completely and was also going to have a great deal of questions later. And Seb said, "Times we know." Mom, times before she could say whatever she was going to say. And she kissed Nico's head, and then Seb's head, and she drove away. The building was in Midtown, a 1920s office conversion. It had the particular quality of a space that had been something else and was remade into something good. Nico noticed the light first. It came through the lobby atrium at an angle that suggested the original architects had thought carefully about what would be inside and what it would need. And the person who had done the restoration had understood that and preserved it. He filed this. His mother had taught him to look at buildings from before he could say why it mattered, and he kept this in mind always. Callum was in the lobby when they came through the door. He was in different clothes, jeans, and a coat that was not the morning suit from the cathedral, which made him look simultaneously more ordinary and more specific. The particular specificity of a person you were meeting in their actual life, rather than in a performance of an occasion. He met them at the door with that same look he'd had in the cathedral and the coffee shop. The look of someone paying full, steady attention. Nico had decided, in the coffee shop, that this was a reliable thing about him. It might be the most reliable thing. This early. The apartment was on the 14th floor. It was the kind of large space designed without a family in mind, then lived in by someone with enough money and not enough time to make it feel like anything in particular. Nico walked through the living room and kitchen and stood at the windows facing north and west. He looked at the city below and thought about what it told him about a person, what they'd chosen to be surrounded by, what they'd invested in, and what they'd left as default. "You don't have a lot of stuff," Seb said, from across the room. Callum looked around the apartment as though seeing it through Seb's description. "No," he said. "I've been meaning to. I've been traveling a lot. I haven't made it into what it should be." "What should it be?" Nico said. Callum looked at him. The question had landed differently than he expected. Nico could see the reception of it in his face. The slight reorganization that happened when someone asked the thing underneath the obvious question. "I don't know," he said. "A home, I suppose. It hasn't felt like one." "What does a home feel like?" Seb said. "I'm not entirely sure I have a reference." He paused. "What does yours feel like?" Seb thought about this with the seriousness it deserved. "Busy," he said. "But the kind of busy that's good. Mom has her drawings on the drafting board, and Nico has his stuff on the coffee table, and there are always books in the wrong places." He looked at Callum. "We argue about the dishes a lot. Who wins? Nobody. We take turns being wrong." Seb looked at the apartment's clean surfaces. "You should have more books in the wrong places." Callum looked at him for a long moment, and Nico watched his father's face in the way he watched faces when he was trying to understand what was under them. And what he saw was something he had not expected to see, which was that the man was genuinely moved by the description of an ordinary household. It was not performed. It was the specific reaction of someone who had been told about something they did not have, and who was feeling the not having clearly for the first time. They stayed for 3 hours. Callum showed them the renovation drawings he had kept them. He'd framed 2 of the original architectural plans on the wall of his study, the most personal thing in the apartment. And it told Nico something important about what the man valued when he let himself value things. They talked about the building, which Nico led because it was his language. And Callum listened and contributed in the way of someone who knew what they knew and was genuinely interested in what Nico knew. They talked about the work he did, the development projects, the housing access initiative, the specific philosophy he had arrived at about what building meant when you did it at scale and with resources. Seb asked questions with the directness he always had, and Callum answered with the same bluntness. Nico watched them and ran the math in his head, the 4 minutes between him and Seb, and what that had produced. Then the 38 years between him and Callum, and what those years had produced. And he thought we got here anyway. At 2 o'clock, Callum said, "I'd like to tell you something, and I want to be honest that I don't know if this is the right time. But I'm going to say it because I've been saying things at the wrong time my entire life, and I'm trying to stop." Nico and Seb looked at him. Nico said, "Okay. I have missed 12 years of your lives, and I cannot get them back, and I am not going to pretend that that is something that can be fixed. But I'm asking both of you, not your mother. I am asking whether you would be willing to see if there is something that can be built from here, not as a replacement for anything, not as a correction of anything, something new. That is what it is, that starts from where we actually are." He looked at them steadily. "I understand if the answer is not now, or if the answer is no. I'm asking because you deserve to be asked." Nico thought about the Google alert he had set up 8 months ago. He thought about the wedding announcement he had folded and placed in the drawer. He thought about the front row of the cathedral and his brother standing up and saying their names, not to create a confrontation, but to create a fact. The fact of their existence. The simple and enormous fact of it. He thought about what he had wanted when he set up the alert, and realized it was exactly this, not an attempt to repair something that had never existed, but the start of a new thing, begun from the true starting point, and with the right information. "Yes," Nico said. Seb was quiet for a moment. He was looking at Callum with the look he had after the cathedral, the completed project look. More complex now, with layers that hadn't been there before. Yes, Seb said, but slowly. Callum looked at them. Slowly, he agreed, as slowly as you need. And you have to talk to Mum, Seb said, not just to us. I know. Like, actually talk to her, not just logistics. Callum looked at him. I intend to, he said. He stopped. He started again. There are things I need to say to her that are not about the logistics. I understand that. Seb held the look for a moment, with the specific quality he had when he was deciding whether to trust something. And then he nodded once, which was his version of endorsement. At 3 o'clock they left. In the elevator, on the way down, Seb looked at Nico, and Nico looked back at him. The look between them was the same one that had passed in the coffee shop when their mother had said yes. We can talk a specific recognition between two people who'd set out to do something and had done it, who were now on the other side of that doing and finding it, looked different. That was good. Seb said, yes. Nico said, I think he's trying. I think so too. Nico watched the floor numbers descend. It's going to take time. Everything does. That's what Mom says. Seb looked at him. She's right about a lot of things. Yes, Nico said. She is. She did not hear from Callum until the following Tuesday, which was 4 days after the Saturday at the building. In those 4 days, she had conducted the specific kind of life maintenance required when you have done something large and need to let it settle before the next thing. She had worked, with 2 client meetings, a site review, and an evening of drawings that needed to happen regardless of anything else. She had cooked dinner twice and ordered once. She had let the boys tell her about the Saturday in their own time and in their own order. Seb first and Nico second, and she had called Danny and given the short version because the long version was not ready yet. On Tuesday evening, she was at the desk in the corner of the living room when the phone rang. She looked at the unknown number, and she thought it's him. She said, I wanted to ask. Callum said, if you'd be willing to have a conversation, not about them, about the 12 years. The part that's about you and me. She sat with this for a moment. She had been thinking about this conversation, not planning it, not preparing for it the way she prepared for professional things. Just living with the knowledge that it existed and waiting for it to become necessary. When she said, whenever works for you. Thursday evening, she said, 7 o'clock. She gave him the name of a restaurant she knew well, a middle-distance restaurant. One that was good enough to take seriously, but not so formal as to make the conversation into something other than what it needed to be. I'll be there, he said. She put the phone down, and she sat at the desk looking at the drawing on the screen. It was a residential project, a small house for a family with 2 young children. She had taken the commission 3 months earlier, and it had been taking her full attention. She looked at the drawing and thought about the conversation that was coming on Thursday. And what she wanted from it was simple, the true version. Whatever that turned out to be, whatever it is. She had said that in the coffee shop, and she had meant it. She had been turning it over since. She checked it from different angles, the way she checked structural calculations, looking for the load-bearing elements and for the places where stress would accumulate. The true version required 2 honest people. She was honest. She was increasingly confident, based on the evidence of the last week, that he was honest too, not perfectly, not without the evasions that 12 years of difficult feelings produced, but genuinely and with effort, the kind of honesty that cost something. On Thursday, she told the boys she had a dinner. Nico looked at her with the specific look. With him, he said. Yes. Nico looked at Seb. Seb looked at Nico. The thing between them was rapid and wordless. And then Seb said, okay, and went back to the video game he had paused. And Nico said, we'll be here, and also went back to what he was doing. and she stood in the living room with her jacket and her bag, and she thought, they are extraordinary, both of them, in ways she had built and ways she had not built, ways that were hers and ways that came from somewhere else she had not been able to account for until last week. She got in a cab. She looked at the city going past the window. She thought about what she was going to say and then stopped. Preparing a speech wasn't what this conversation required. It needed the steadiness she'd been practicing for 12 years. What this conversation required was the thing she had been learning to do for 12 years, which was to be in the room with what was true, completely, without the management of performance. He was at the restaurant when she arrived, not early for show, but early because he was someone who arrived before the time he had said, which she recognized. He was looking at the menu when she came in, and he looked up when she sat down. The look had the quality of someone who'd been waiting and wasn't going to pretend the wait had been casual. "Hi," he said. "Hi." They ordered. They were quiet for a moment in the way of people who have a great deal to say and are determining what goes first. She said, "I want to ask you something I've been asking myself for the last week." He looked at her. "All right. If you had known if someone had called you in October of that year and told you I was pregnant, what would you have done?" He was quiet for a long time. Not the quiet of avoidance, but the quiet of genuine consideration. She waited because she had always been good at waiting for answers that needed time. "I would have been terrified," he said. "We had been together 6 months and I was 26, and I didn't know I had no model for what being a parent looked like. My father was not someone whose model I wanted." He looked at the table. "But I would have been there, whatever there looked like. I would have wanted to be there." He paused. "I hope that's true and not just what I want to believe about myself." Why the distinction? Because it's easy to say what you would have done when there's no cost to the answer. The cost was 12 years ago. I don't know for certain who I was then. He looked up. "I think I would have tried. I know that's not enough." She thought about 26-year-old Callum. She thought about the specific quality he had then, the thing she'd been trying to describe to herself for 12 years as a way of understanding how she'd loved him. She was now sitting across from that quality in its 38-year-old form. The quality was that he thought things through before he spoke. When he did, his words were as close to true as he could make them. "It's honest," she said. "That's what I needed." "Sarah." He said her name with the weight of someone who has been holding it a long time. "I'm sorry for the choices I made and the questions I didn't ask and the 12 years. He looked at her directly, without the management of someone trying to get a specific response. "I can't fix it. I know that. I'm not asking you to pretend it's fixable. I'm asking whether there's something to build from where we are." She looked at him. She looked at the restaurant around them. She thought about her sons at home, playing video games and checking in with each other in the specific language of twins. And about the 12 years, the pre-war apartment, the house she was designing for a family with 2 young children, and the light that would come through that house's north windows in the afternoon. "What would you build?" she said. He thought about this. She could see him thinking, could see the consideration of it. "I don't know yet," he said. "I have a direction. I'm not going to pretend I have a plan." That's the same thing you said in the coffee shop. It was true then. It's true now. Pause. "What would you build?" She had been thinking about it for a week, in the background of all the other things. She had thought about it with the same methodical attention she gave to professional problems. She found the constraints, identified the load-bearing elements, and tested the structure. She had arrived at the beginning of an answer, not a complete one. The beginning. "Something honest," she said. "I don't know the form of it. I know what it has to be made of." He looked at her. He said, "That's enough to start." She thought about starting. She thought about the 12 years that were behind her and the things she had built in them her career, her sons. She thought about the specific competence of a person who had been required to be sufficient and had become so. She thought about what starting something from a place of sufficiency, rather than from need, would be like. She thought, this is different from 26. Everything is different, including me. I have conditions. She said, name them. The boys set the pace. With you and with them. They decide what they want and when and how much, and you honor that without pressure. Yes, you're honest with me about what's happening with Isolde and with whatever is coming. I don't need the details. I need to know the situation clearly. Yes, and she paused. You stay. Whatever this becomes, you don't disappear when it gets complicated. She looked at him steadily. That's the one that matters most. He held her gaze. I know, he said, and I know you have no reason to believe that from me. I'm not going to ask you to believe it. I'm going to ask you to watch and see. She thought about watching. She thought about what she had been watching for 12 years and what watching from here would look like, and whether she had enough of herself left to extend the possibility of something without requiring the certainty she would not have. She thought about what her sons had done, the Google alert, the front row, the names said out loud. She thought about what it meant that they had been more ready than she had, and whether ready was something she was going to let herself be. She thought I chose to carry this story for 12 years without checking whether it was right. I can choose differently now. Not because the 12 years were not real, they were real. And they cost what they cost, but because I am a person who chooses, and the choosing is mine. And what I choose from here is what I actually decide. All right, she said. We watch and see. He exhaled, not with relief, with the specific quality of someone who has received something they were not taking for granted and who knows it. Thank you, he said. Don't thank me yet. She picked up her glass. We're at the beginning. Yes, he said. We are. The beginning was not comfortable. She had not expected it to be. Beginnings were not comfort. They were the place where the direction was established, where the first load-bearing decisions were made, where the foundation was either sound or not. She had spent 12 years on a foundation that had been assembled with incomplete information. This foundation was going to be built differently, slowly, with the correct material, tested as it went. She thought about Nico saying times, it's going to take time. Times to Seb in the elevator. She thought about Seb saying times, everything does. And she thought, they are right. They have always been right. Both of them. In the specific and ordinary way of people who have been paying attention. They had paid attention, and they had acted on what they saw, and they had sat in the front row of a cathedral and made themselves real to a person who had not known they existed. And in doing that, they had made the conversation she was now in the middle of possible. She owed them that knowledge. She was going to give it to them, when the time was right, in the way she gave them things that mattered, not with ceremony, but with honesty. The specific honesty of a parent who understood that her children deserved the complete version of things because they were capable of holding it, and because she had made them capable of holding it. She looked at Callum across the table, and she thought about the 12 years and about what came after. She did not know what came after. She had not known. On the Tuesday afternoon, when Nico had placed the printed announcement in the drawer, and she did not know now. And the not knowing was no longer a thing she was required to resolve before she could move. She could move through the not knowing. She had been doing it for 12 years. In fact, moving through it, building anyway, letting the uncertainty be what it was while she built around it. The building was the thing she knew how to do. The building was what she had always known how to do. She picked up her glass. She looked at him. She thought, here is the true version. Finally, it is complicated and not what I thought it was. It contains 12 years of something that was not right. And it also contains 2 people who sat in the front row of a cathedral and made themselves real. And from that true version, something can be built. Not everything, not the thing that was lost. Something new. She was going to find out what it was. That was enough. For now. That was exactly enough.